The war did not slow down for winter. It detonated into it. In December of 1944, the Western Front shattered under snow, fog, and surprise. What had seemed like a steady Allied advance toward Germany collapsed into confusion almost overnight. Roads vanished beneath ice. Communications failed. Units were cut off without warning, and through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German armor surged forward with a speed that stunned everyone watching the line buckle in real time. This was not a planned retreat. It was a crisis. The German offensive tore a deep bulge into the Allied front, aiming not just for ground, but for momentum itself. Supply routes were severed. Towns fell. Entire formations found themselves isolated in hostile terrain, with winter tightening its grip by the hour. At the center of the chaos stood Bastogne, a critical road junction whose control would determine whether the offensive could continue or collapse. Bastogne was surrounded, and time was running out. While much of the Allied command scrambled to understand the scale of the disaster, one commander was already moving. George S. Patton did not wait for perfect clarity. He did not wait for ideal conditions. He had anticipated crisis long before it arrived, and now preparation met necessity. Patton's Third Army was driving east, deep into France, oriented entirely toward Germany. To reach Bastogne, that entire force would have to do something almost unheard of under combat conditions: reverse direction. Not a single division, not a single corps, an entire army. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, artillery, fuel, and supplies would pivot north through frozen roads under the pressure of an enemy still advancing. This was not improvisation, it was execution. Staff officers worked without pause. Orders were stripped to essentials. Columns began moving day and night, often without lights, navigating icy roads clogged with refugees, wreckage, and retreating units. Vehicles broke down, engines froze, fuel ran short. Men slept where they stopped, if they slept at all. Speed was everything. Every hour lost meant another tightening of the noose around Bastogne. The defenders did not need rescue eventually. They needed it now. The German timetable depended on holding that road network. If Bastogne held, the offensive stalled. If it fell, the door west might stay open long enough to change the war. The race was brutal. German roadblocks were fortified. Villages became killing zones. Artillery fire shattered narrow approaches. Patton's forces advanced anyway, often into contact before units were fully assembled, accepting risk because delay was worse. Progress was measured in miles clawed forward through snow, fire, and exhaustion. Casualties mounted. Vehicles were abandoned. Men fought with frozen hands and numb feet, driven forward by orders that left no room for hesitation. And still, the columns moved. When the relief finally reached Bastogne, it did more than crack a siege. It shattered the German timetable. What had been an offensive built on speed now found itself bleeding momentum it could never recover. The initiative slipped away, not in a single dramatic moment, but through the grinding reality of time lost and pressure applied from multiple directions. The Patton did not stop there. Relief turned into pursuit. Defense turned into pressure. The bulge began to collapse inward. Patton's race to Bastogne was not just a dramatic maneuver. It was a demonstration of operational warfare under extreme pressure. It showed how preparation, decisiveness, and speed could still shape outcomes even when chaos dominated the battlefield. It proved that leadership could impose order on disaster and turn crisis into opportunity. This was not a story of luck. It was a story of readiness revealed. Tonight we return to that frozen emergency, to the roads choked with snow and steel, to the orders issued before the crisis fully arrived, to the race that broke the German offensive and restored the balance of the war in the West. This is Patton's race to Bastogne, the moment when movement became survival, and speed became salvation. December 15th, 1944, 0600 hours. Private Richard McKee pulled his coat tighter against the morning cold and watched his breath fog in the Belgian air. Around him, the forest stood silent. He was sitting in a foxhole along what the men called the Ghost Front, an 85-mile stretch of the Ardennes where nothing ever happened. The worst thing about this sector wasn't the Germans. It was the boredom. McKee had arrived with the 106th Infantry Division just 5 days earlier, fresh from England, and already he was writing letters home, describing this place as the quietest corner of the European war. His company commander had told him the Ardennes was where divisions went to rest, where green troops learned the ropes without getting shot at, where the war felt more like camping than combat. In the distance, somewhere beyond the dark tree line, lay Germany. But it might as well have been the moon. What McKee didn't know, what none of the 11,000 men of the 106th knew, was that they were sitting in a carefully designed trap. Across those silent woods, hidden in the morning darkness, over 250,000 German soldiers were moving into position. 1,400 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces. They had been assembling for weeks in complete radio silence, moving only at night, using horses to pull guns so the engine noise wouldn't give them away. German soldiers had been ordered not to light fires, not to make unnecessary sounds, and not to do anything that might alert the Americans that the largest German offensive since 1940 had been staged directly in front of them. Every captured prisoner had been kept away from the front lines. Every reconnaissance patrol had been carefully controlled. The deception was nearly perfect, and the 106th Infantry Division, spread thin across a 16-mile front, had no idea they were about to become the opening act of Hitler's final desperate gamble in the West. The American intelligence failure wasn't just about missing this one offensive. It was systematic, institutional, almost willful. For months, Allied intelligence officers had been analyzing reports of German troop movements, rail traffic, supply concentrations. Colonel Oscar Koch, intelligence officer for Patton's Third Army, it had been warning since early December that something was building in the Ardennes. His reports noted unusual patterns, veteran divisions disappearing from the line, fuel depots being established behind quiet sectors. But at Supreme Headquarters, these warnings were dismissed. The prevailing wisdom was simple and wrong. Germany was defeated, beaten, incapable of offensive action. Every intelligence assessment began with that assumption and worked backward. When evidence contradicted it, analysts found ways to explain the evidence away. Troop movements were defensive preparations. Supply buildups were for the Eastern Front. Radio silence meant nothing was happening, not that something was being hidden. The Allies had convinced themselves that the war was nearly won, and that conviction made them blind. The 106th Infantry Division occupied what military planners called the Schnee Eifel, a forested ridgeline that jutted like a finger into German territory. It was exactly the kind of position that looks good on a map and proves disastrous in combat. The division was spread across 16 miles, holding a salient with Germans on 3 sides. Each regiment was responsible for territory. That doctrine said required a full division. But this was the ghost front, where nothing happened, so the thinness seemed acceptable. The men lived in log-covered foxholes, ate hot meals trucked up from the rear, and conducted patrols that never made contact. Some had started calling it the rest home. Officers played cards in village houses. Supply sergeants worried more about Christmas packages than ammunition. And when McKee finished his letter that morning of the December 15th, describing how peaceful everything was, he wasn't lying. He was simply the last man to experience a version of the war that was about to end forever. 0530, December 16th. The world exploded. German artillery opened fire across the entire 85-mile front with a barrage unlike anything the Western Allies had experienced. Over 2,000 guns firing simultaneously, shells screaming through the darkness, hitting American positions that had been precisely mapped during weeks of quiet observation. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Entire command posts vanished. Communications lines were cut. Forward positions disappeared under waves of high explosive. And then, out of the morning darkness, came searchlights. The Germans were using anti-aircraft searchlights aimed at low clouds, creating artificial moonlight that illuminated the American positions while leaving the attackers in shadow. Through this eerie glow came German infantry, moving in waves, overwhelming foxholes before the defenders could react. Behind them came the tanks. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a local attack. This was something the Allies hadn't planned for, hadn't prepared for, and didn't know how to stop. At his headquarters in Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley received the first reports around 8 in the morning. They were confused, contradictory, impossible to believe. One corps reported heavy attacks. Another said nothing unusual. A third had lost contact with 2 regiments. Bradley's initial reaction was dismissal. These had to be spoiling attacks. Limited German efforts to disrupt the American offensives planned farther north and south. Maybe a division-strength attack, 2 at most. The idea that Germany could launch a major offensive was absurd. They didn't have the fuel, didn't have the reserves, didn't have the capability. Every intelligence estimate said so, but as the morning progressed and reports kept flooding in, the absurd became undeniable. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that this wasn't a spoiling attack. German forces were attacking across the entire Ardennes front. Entire American regiments had been surrounded. Tank columns were reported driving deep into Allied rear areas, and nobody knew where the main effort was aimed because the attacks seemed to be everywhere at once. The weather was Germany's silent ally. Heavy fog and low clouds blanketed the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and eliminating the one advantage American commanders counted on absolutely. Air superiority meant nothing when planes couldn't fly. Reconnaissance couldn't see through the clouds. Bombers couldn't hit German columns. Close air support couldn't help American infantry being overrun. The Germans had planned the offensive specifically for this weather window, knowing that if they could achieve surprises and move fast, they might break through before the Allies could react. And in those first hours, the plan was working perfectly. American units were fighting blind, cut off from higher command, unable to call for support, uncertain where the enemy was or where friendly forces might be. Some units fought to the last round, others broke and ran. It most simply tried to survive in a landscape that had transformed from sleepy backwater to apocalyptic chaos in the space of a morning. By December 17th, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division had been encircled in the Schnee Eifel. German armor was advancing on multiple axes, some columns already 20 miles behind what had been the American front line. Towns that had been safe rear areas were suddenly battle zones. Supply dumps were being overrun or hastily evacuated. And across the Ardennes, American soldiers who had never fired their weapons in anger were facing veteran German divisions in the worst possible conditions. Winter warfare, forest fighting, encirclement. The psychological shock was almost as damaging as the military one. For months, when American troops had been told the Germans were beaten. Now those beaten Germans were advancing with confidence and power, and nobody seemed to know how to stop them. The Ghost Front had become the most violent sector of the Western Front, and the men who had thought they were safely away from the war were dying in numbers that wouldn't be fully counted for weeks. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Dwight Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting on the evening of December 16th. His intelligence chief, Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, laid out what they knew: a major German offensive across the Ardennes, estimated strength of at least 15 divisions, possibly more. Objectives unclear, but probably aimed at the Meuse River crossings. If the Germans reached the Meuse, they could threaten Antwerp, the main Allied supply port. If they took Antwerp, the entire Allied position in northwestern Europe could collapse. The implications were staggering. 6 months after D-Day, 5 months after the liberation of Paris, the Germans were not only still fighting, but capable of launching an offensive that threatened everything the Allies had achieved. Eisenhower made 2 immediate decisions. First, rush reinforcements to the Ardennes, particularly the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. Second, expand the flanks of the penetration to prevent a complete breakthrough. But he was reacting, not controlling. The initiative belonged entirely to the Germans. The civilian refugees began streaming westward on December 17th. Belgian villagers who had welcomed American liberators 3 months earlier now fled ahead of the German advance. That's old people pushed carts loaded with whatever they could carry. Families crowded into trucks alongside retreating American soldiers. Some had lived through this before, in 1940, when German tanks had come through these same forests, and the world had learned what blitzkrieg meant. Now it was happening again. The roads became clogged with military vehicles trying to move forward and civilians trying to move back, creating gridlock that made military movement almost impossible. American military police tried to maintain order, but the chaos was overwhelming, and through it all, German infiltrators dressed in American uniforms spread confusion, changing road signs, cutting telephone wires, spreading rumors that made the panic worse. In those first 48 hours, thence the Ardennes transformed from the quietest sector on the Western Front to a landscape of terror, confusion, and catastrophic military crisis. The Ghost Front had proven to be haunted after all, not by the dead, but by the living nightmare of an army that refused to admit it was beaten. December 12, 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Colonel Oscar Koch stood before a map covered in red symbols and tried to convince men who didn't want to be convinced. As Chief Intelligence Officer for George Patton's 3rd Army, Koch had spent weeks tracking patterns that nobody else seemed to notice. Railroad traffic moving west when it should be moving east. Veteran divisions disappearing from sectors opposite the 3rd Army. Radio intercepts showing unusual silence from areas that should be busy. Their prisoner interrogations mentioning leaves being canceled and supplies being stockpiled. Individually, these items meant little. Together, they formed a picture that Koch found deeply disturbing. He believed the Germans were preparing a major offensive, probably in the Ardennes, probably within the next 2 weeks. His staff looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Germany was beaten. Everyone knew that. Intelligence estimates from Supreme Headquarters said Germany lacked the fuel, the reserves, and the capability for offensive operations. But Koch had learned to trust his instincts more than other people's certainties. What made Koch different from other intelligence officers was his methodology. While most Allied intelligence focused on confirming what commanders already believed, as Koch actively looked for evidence that contradicted the prevailing wisdom. He studied not just what the Germans were doing, but what they weren't doing. The absence of radio traffic in certain sectors worried him more than the presence of it in others. When veteran German divisions went quiet, he didn't assume they'd been destroyed or sent east. He assumed they were being hidden for something important. His approach was unpopular because it generated warnings that proved false more often than not. But Koch believed that one true warning was worth 10 false alarms. And in early December 1944, every instinct he'd developed through years of intelligence work was screaming that something catastrophic was coming. Patton himself was a study in contradictions during this period. Publicly aggressive and confident, or privately frustrated to the point of rage. His 3rd Army had been driving toward the Saar region, fighting brutal battles for minimal gains, losing men at rates that made even Patton wince. He wanted to break through the German West Wall, wanted to be the general who led the final charge into Germany. Instead, he was stuck in what felt like World War I trench warfare, grinding forward a few hundred yards at a time. When Koch presented his intelligence estimate on December 12th, Patton's reaction was complex. Part of him dismissed it as unlikely. Part of him hoped it was true because it might give him something to do besides bleed his army white against fortifications. And part of him, the part that had studied military history obsessively since childhood, that recognized that Koch might be right because the Ardennes was exactly where he would attack if he were commanding the Germans. December 13th changed everything, though most of Patton's staff wouldn't realize it until later. That evening, Patton convened what he called a war council. He ordered his operations officer, his logistics officer, and his chief of staff to wargame 3 contingency plans for moving 3rd Army north. He assigned them code names. Plan 1 involved sending the 6th Armored Division north immediately. Plan 2 involved shifting an entire corps, roughly 3 divisions, to strike north into the flank of any German penetration. Plan 3 was radical. Pivot the entire 3rd Army 90 degrees from east to north, abandoning the Saar offensive entirely to strike at the Germans from the south. His staff thought this was a theoretical exercise, the kind of staff college problem that kept generals busy when they were bored. Only Patton knew he was serious. Only Patton understood that Koch's warning had convinced him to prepare for something that everyone else considered impossible. The psychology of command was Patton's secret weapon, though few people understood it that way. Other generals tried to make realistic plans based on probable scenarios. Patton made ambitious plans based on possible scenarios, then bullied reality into matching his ambitions. He was famously superstitious, believed in reincarnation, talked about having fought in ancient battles. But beneath the mysticism was cold calculation. He knew that wars were won by commanders who acted faster than their enemies expected. The German offensive, if it came, it would create chaos. In chaos, the commander who could move fastest would dominate. So Patton made his staff plan for what they considered impossible, knowing that if the impossible happened, Third Army would be the only formation ready to respond. His diary entry from December 13th was revealing. It seems certain the Boche will attack. Everyone else is living in a fool's paradise. When he does, I'll be ready. When Bradley called on the evening of December 16th to inform Patton of the German offensive, Patton's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up. Bradley thought Patton was joking or grandstanding. He wasn't. Patton had spent 4 days mentally preparing for exactly this scenario. While other commanders were still trying to understand what was happening, Patton was already planning his response. He told Bradley he could attack north with 3 divisions by December 22nd. Bradley, dealing with chaos and confusion across the entire Ardennes front, thought Patton was either lying or delusional. Moving 3 divisions 90 degrees in 6 days while those divisions were actively engaged in combat was theoretically impossible. Patton didn't argue. He simply said, "I'll be there." Then he hung up and started giving orders. The contrast between Patton's public persona and private calculation was never more apparent than in the days following December 16th. In staff meetings, he was theatrical, aggressive, apparently cavalier about the German threat. Thus, he talked about letting the Germans advance to Paris so he could cut them off more decisively. He made jokes about rescuing surrounded units. His staff, accustomed to his style, understood this was theater. But beneath the performance was meticulous planning. Patton spent hours studying maps, calculating road distances, analyzing where German supply lines would be most vulnerable. He read Koch's intelligence updates obsessively, trying to determine where the German main effort was aimed, and he made a critical decision that other commanders avoided. He decided that Bastogne, a town nobody had heard of, was where the battle would be decided, not because Bastogne was strategically important in itself, but because it was a road hub, and the Germans needed those roads for their supply columns. Patton's relationship with his staff during this period reveals how truly effective commanders function. He didn't tell them how to do their jobs. He told them what results he needed and let them figure out the methods. When he ordered the movement north, he gave his logistics officer, Colonel Walter Mueller, an impossible deadline and complete authority to meet it however necessary. When he told his operations officer to plan 3 simultaneous attacks into the German flank, he didn't micromanage the details. This delegation was Patton's genius. He understood that an army was too complex for one man to control directly. But one man could set the tone, establish the pace, and create an environment where other talented officers could perform at their best. Rodin, his staff worked 20-hour days not because Patton ordered them to, but because Patton made them believe they were part of something historic. December 17th brought a moment of private doubt that Patton recorded only in his diary. "We can still lose this war," he wrote. The entry is revealing because it shows Patton understood the stakes in a way few other American generals did. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, if they managed to take Antwerp, if they succeeded in splitting the Allied armies, the war might drag on for another year. American public opinion might turn against the endless casualties. Political pressure might force a negotiated peace that left Germany intact. These weren't paranoid fantasies. They were genuine strategic possibilities. And Patton, for all his bravado, and understood that the next few weeks would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, but potentially the entire war. This knowledge drove him to demand the impossible from his army, because he believed impossible speed was the only thing that could prevent disaster. By December 18th, Patton's preparations were complete. His 3 contingency plans had been fleshed out with detailed movement orders, supply allocations, and attack objectives. His staff had identified every road that could support armored movement from the Saar to the Ardennes. His logistics officers had calculated fuel requirements and arranged for supply dumps to be relocated north. And Patton himself had made the most important decision of all. He would commit his entire army to the relief effort, not just part of it. This was characteristic Patton. 8 half measures were for cautious men. Patton believed in committing everything to the critical point, trusting that overwhelming force applied at the decisive moment would shatter any defense. What nobody yet knew, including Patton, was whether the decisive moment would come in time, or whether the men in Bastogne would still be alive when Third Army arrived. The prophet had predicted the crisis. The question was whether prophecy alone could save lives. December 18th, 1944, 0200 hours. Colonel Walter J. Mueller stared at a map that represented an impossibility. As Third Army's logistics officer, his job was to make possible what Patton promised. Now, Patton had promised to move the entire Third Army 90 degrees from its current attack posture toward the Saar to a new attack posture toward the Ardennes. This meant rotating a force of 250,000 men and 133,178 motor vehicles through a 90-degree turn while maintaining combat operations on one front and preparing for combat operations on another. Staff colleges taught that such movements required weeks of planning and perfect weather. Mueller had 48 hours and a forecast calling for ice storms. The mathematics alone were staggering. Every vehicle needed fuel, every unit needed ammunition. Every formation had to arrive at its attack position on time, or the entire operation would collapse into gridlock. One mistake, one traffic jam, one unit taking the wrong road, and Third Army would freeze in place, unable to fight in either direction. The road network made everything worse, and only 3 parallel roads were capable of handling armored divisions moving north. These roads ran through Luxembourg, a tiny country whose entire road system was designed for local traffic, not mechanized armies. Each road would have to carry a full division, plus its support elements, all moving at night to avoid German air attack, all coordinating with units moving perpendicular to them as the army pivoted. Mueller's staff calculated that at any given moment, vehicles would be passing through over 500 intersections. Each intersection was a potential catastrophe. If 2 columns arrived at the same intersection simultaneously, both would stop. Everything behind them would stop. The entire movement could freeze like blood clotting in an artery. The solution required choreography more complex than anything attempted on D-Day. Every battalion had to enter every road at a specific time, down to 15-minute windows. Violate your window, and you could destroy the entire operation. The fuel calculations kept Mueller awake at night. Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of fuel per day under normal circumstances. During the movement north, consumption would spike because vehicles moving at night with blackout lights got lower fuel efficiency. Worse, all of Third Army's fuel dumps were positioned for an eastward offensive. Now, everything had to be rerouted north, while simultaneously maintaining supply to units still fighting in the Saar. Mueller's logistics staff calculated they needed to establish temporary fuel dumps along the northern route, pre-position them before the main body of the army arrived. And coordinate delivery schedules so units could refuel without stopping. The margin for error was 0. Run out of fuel anywhere in the column, and vehicles would block the road for everyone behind them. The Germans didn't need to stop Third Army. Simple logistics could do it just as effectively. December 18th morning brought the first test of Mueller's planning. Units began receiving movement orders while they were still in active combat. Some battalions got 6 hours' notice to disengage from the enemy, pack up, and begin moving north. Imagine being a company commander told that your unit, which has been fighting for a week straight, needs to break contact, withdraw, and be on the road heading north by 1400 hours. Your men are exhausted. Your equipment is damaged. You don't know if the Germans will exploit your withdrawal, but the orders are absolute. The entire Third Army is moving, and if your unit isn't in position on time, you'll break the chain. For junior officers, this was the hardest test of the war. They had to motivate men who could barely stand, organize movements under fire, and maintain unit cohesion during a withdrawal, the most dangerous military operation. The march table became Mueller's Bible. 336 pages created in 48 hours, specifying when each battalion would enter which road, which route each unit would follow, where each formation would halt for rest, and where each supply point was located. The document represented thousands of hours of staff work compressed into 2 days. Officers worked in shifts, sleeping under desks, and eating while they calculated. The final version went out to units on December 19th, giving most commanders less than 12 hours to study it before their movement windows opened. Some units never received it at all, their copies lost in the chaos of combat. They navigated by following the vehicle ahead of them and hoping it knew where it was going. This was modern war, where success depended as much on clerks calculating timetables as on soldiers firing rifles. Weather became the enemy that no planning could defeat. December 18th and 19th brought ice storms that turned roads into skating rinks. Vehicles skidded off roads. Tanks threw tracks on icy turns. Half-tracks jackknifed, blocking intersections. The average speed dropped from a planned 20 miles per hour to 8 miles per hour in some sectors. A. Muller's carefully calculated timetables began falling apart within hours of the movement starting. But here, American logistics flexibility proved decisive. When one route became impassable, traffic controllers rerouted entire divisions onto alternate roads. When vehicles broke down, they were pushed off the road immediately, and recovery vehicles followed hours later. The movement kept flowing, not because the plan was perfect, but because the plan was flexible, and because American soldiers at every level understood that maintaining momentum mattered more than following exact instructions. The engineers performed miracles that historians barely acknowledge. Every bridge on the northern route had to be inspected and certified, capable of handling 68,000-pound Sherman tanks. As some bridges failed inspection and had to be reinforced while traffic waited, others were bypassed entirely, forcing units to use fords that had to be prepared in darkness under the threat of German attack. Engineer battalions marked routes with colored signs. Each division assigned a color. If you were in the 4th Armored Division, you followed green signs. If you were in the 26th Infantry Division, you followed blue signs. This simple system prevented thousands of wrong turns. But it only worked because engineers worked ahead of the main columns, installing signs at night in territory that might still be contested, risking capture or death to mark intersections that tanks would reach hours later. Communication was the nightmare within the nightmare. And radio discipline had to be perfect, because German signals intelligence was listening. But maintaining radio discipline meant units couldn't ask for help when they got lost. They had to navigate by dead reckoning and hope. Telephone lines were unreliable because they were being cut by German infiltrators and saboteurs. Motorcycle couriers carried messages but could be delayed by traffic or enemy action. The result was that units often moved for hours without clear information about what was happening elsewhere in the formation. Company commanders made decisions based on incomplete information, hoping their choices aligned with the overall plan, praying they weren't accidentally disrupting someone else's movement. This was the fog of war in its purest form, where confusion was the natural state and clarity was a rare gift. By December 19th, 0400 hours, the first major units began moving north. Staff officers at 3rd Army headquarters waited in tense silence, knowing that the next several hours would determine whether Patton's promise was brilliant or insane. If the movement worked, if units arrived on schedule, if the road network didn't collapse under the strain, then 3rd Army would be in position to attack on December 22nd. If the movement failed, if gridlock developed, if units arrived piecemeal and exhausted, then Patton's promise would be revealed as empty bravado, and the men surrounded in Bastogne would die waiting for a rescue that couldn't come. Muller watched reports arrive from road control points, each one indicating another unit successfully entering the movement. He allowed himself a moment of hope. Then he went back to calculating, because hope wasn't enough. In war, only execution mattered, and execution required endless, grinding, unglamorous work by people whose names would never appear in history books. The final irony was that while Patton got credit for the movement north, hundreds of officers like Muller made it possible. Patton's genius was in demanding the impossible and trusting his staff to achieve it, but the staff's genius was in understanding that impossible simply meant nobody had done it yet, not that it couldn't be done. They took Patton's theatrical promises and translated them into convoy schedules, fuel allocations, and route assignments. They turned rhetoric into logistics, and logistics into military power. When Soviet military historians studied this operation after the war, they focused not on Patton's leadership, but on 3rd Army's logistics staff. They understood that the movement north represented the highest form of military art, the ability to project force across distance faster than the enemy could react. The geometry of war was mathematical, not mystical. And in December 1944, American staff officers proved they could calculate faster than their enemies could. December 19th, 1944. Evening. Sergeant Jim Notestein stood in the turret of his Sherman tank and watched his battalion stretch back into darkness until the convoy disappeared into night. The 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, was moving north towards something called the Ardennes. Notestein had been fighting continuously for 6 days before receiving orders to disengage and head north. Yet his crew was running on maybe 2 hours of sleep in the past 72 hours. The Sherman's engine was overdue for maintenance. The tracks needed adjustment. The gun sight had a crack that maintenance promised to fix weeks ago. None of that mattered now. Somewhere north, Americans were surrounded. Patton had promised to relieve them. And that promise meant moving, regardless of exhaustion, regardless of mechanical problems, regardless of the ice forming on every metal surface. The convoy moved with only blackout lights, tiny blue markers barely visible 20 yards ahead. Following the tank in front meant watching for those lights and hoping the lead tank knew where it was going. The physical toll of the movement north never made it into official histories. All men who had been in continuous combat for a week were now being asked to drive through ice storms for 10 to 15 hours without rest. Tankers rode in open turrets, exposed to temperatures hovering between 10 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Infantry and half-tracks had it worse. The vehicles were open-topped, offering no protection from wind and freezing rain. Men wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they could find. But nothing helped much. Frostbite casualties began appearing within hours of the movement starting. Fingers froze to metal, feet went numb in wet boots, and everyone knew that complaining was pointless. You couldn't stop the convoy to warm up. You couldn't pull over to change socks. You either kept moving or you fell out, and falling out meant you'd failed the men in Bastogne who were counting on you. As December 20th, 0300 hours, brought disaster to one company when their lead Sherman broke through ice covering a ford and blocked the entire crossing. The battalion behind them stacked up for miles, idling vehicles consuming fuel, while engineers worked in 28-degree water with welding torches to cut the sunken tank free. This was the nightmare scenario that Muller's planning had tried to prevent, and now it was happening anyway. Engineers in the water were at risk of hypothermia within minutes. The welding torches barely worked in the wet, and every minute the column sat idle, it consumed fuel from reserve tanks that might be needed for combat. 4 hours. That's how long it took to clear the ford. 4 hours of hundreds of vehicles sitting motionless while soldiers slowly froze, and officers calculated how much this delay would cost. When the column finally started moving again, men had to be physically lifted back into their vehicles because they couldn't climb on their own. The civilians of Luxembourg watched the American army flow north with expressions that veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. Silent, somber, knowing. Some of these Luxembourgers had watched German tanks move through their villages in 1940, going the other direction, beginning the conquest of France. Now they were watching Americans rush north to fight Germans again, in winter again, and the look in their eyes suggested they'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Some villagers offered hot coffee to soldiers when columns halted. Others just watched from windows, faces showing neither hope nor despair, just the exhausted recognition that their country was once again a battlefield. For the American soldiers, these faces were more disturbing than enemy fire. They suggested that what seemed heroic from inside the convoy looked more like repetition from outside it. Mechanical casualties mounted as the movement progressed. 10 to 15% of vehicles broke down during the march, victims of poor maintenance, cold weather, and mechanical stress from continuous operation. Each breakdown created a crisis. Disabled vehicles had to be pushed or towed off the road immediately, or they'd block traffic. Recovery vehicles followed hours behind the main columns, collecting disabled tanks and trucks. You were trying to repair them in field conditions that made any maintenance nearly impossible. Some equipment was simply abandoned, left beside roads with notes explaining what was wrong, hoping that rear echelon maintenance units would recover them eventually. This attrition was expected, planned for, but still devastating. Every tank lost to mechanical failure was one less tank for the attack. Every truck broken down was one less truck for supplies. The margin between success and failure was measured in working vehicles, and that margin was shrinking with every mile. Navigation in darkness became an exercise in faith. With blackout lights providing almost no illumination, drivers navigated by watching for the vehicle ahead and hoping it was going the right way. Miss a turn, and your entire company might end up miles off course. Follow the wrong vehicle, and you could find yourself in a different division sector. This happened repeatedly. Companies took wrong roads, realized their mistake hours later, had to backtrack while other units flowed around them. The colored sign system worked when you could see the signs. At night, in snow, with exhausted drivers squinting through vision slits, the system was less reliable. Officers navigated by dead reckoning and occasionally by asking local civilians for directions. An absurd image of American armor columns asking Belgian farmers which way to the war. December 21st, night, brought the psychological breaking point for many soldiers. They had been told they were moving to relieve Bastogne. They had no idea where Bastogne was, what was happening there, or why it mattered. They just knew they were cold, then exhausted, and driving through darkness towards something that felt increasingly unreal. Some men fell asleep while driving. Sergeant Notestein watched one Sherman drift off the road into a ditch because the driver simply passed out at the controls. The crew spent 4 hours in darkness trying to extract their tank, while the rest of the battalion flowed past. They used every curse word in the English language, and several they invented. They worked until their hands bled, and when they finally got the Sherman back on the road, they just rejoined the column and kept driving because stopping wasn't an option. December the 22nd, morning, the crossing from Luxembourg into Belgium felt symbolic, even though nobody said anything. This was the moment when Third Army officially entered the Ardennes. Patton himself stood roadside in the snow, saluting every vehicle that passed. Soldiers looked at him through exhausted eyes and wondered if he understood what he was asking of them. Some saluted back, others just stared. A few slept right past him, too exhausted to notice. Patton stood there for hours, rigid, saluting, creating the image that would later appear in histories and memoirs. What those histories wouldn't capture was the cost already paid just to reach this point. Men who hadn't slept in days. Equipment breaking down faster than mechanics could repair it. Units scattered across 3 countries, trying to reassemble in time for an attack nobody had planned in detail. The moral complexity of the movement north haunted soldiers in ways they couldn't articulate at the time. They were abandoning ground they'd captured at terrible cost weeks earlier. Towns their friends had died taking were being left to whatever German forces might reoccupy them. The offensive toward the Saar, which had consumed so many lives, was being abandoned as if it had never mattered. And they were heading north to fight battles they didn't understand, to save people they'd never met, in a town they'd never heard of. This cognitive dissonance created a strange emotional state where men performed superhuman feats of endurance while simultaneously questioning whether any of it meant anything. They drove through ice storms because orders said, drive. They fought exhaustion because surrender to exhaustion meant failure. But beneath the obedience was a growing realization that war was less about heroism than about enduring things that should be unendurable. By the time 4th Armored Division completed its movement north, roughly 30 hours after starting, the formation had transformed. Units that began as coordinated battalions arrived as scattered collections of vehicles. Company commanders counted their tanks and found they had lost 15% to mechanical breakdown. Soldiers climbed down from vehicles unable to walk properly because their legs had cramped from the cold and inactivity. And yet, somehow, impossibly, they had arrived. Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees while maintaining combat operations and arrived in position to attack, more or less on schedule. Muller's impossible mathematics had worked. Patton's impossible promise was about to be tested, and the exhausted soldiers of 4th Armored Division, who had just completed one of the most difficult movements in military history, were about to be asked to do something even harder: attack a prepared enemy with no rest, no time to reorganize, and no guarantee that anyone in Bastogne was still alive to be rescued. December 19th, 1944, 1100 hours, Verdun, France. The conference room was a cold barracks building that smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. Eisenhower entered to find the Allied High Command, waiting. Bradley, Devers, Patton, Tedder from the RAF, Strong from intelligence. The atmosphere was tense in a way that these meetings rarely were. Everyone knew why they were here. The German offensive had torn a bulge in the Allied line that was growing wider every hour. Entire American divisions were surrounded or scattered. And nobody knew where the German main effort was aimed. And political pressure from Washington and London was mounting as newspapers reported what looked like the worst American defeat since Pearl Harbor. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a line that would become famous. "I want only cheerful faces at this table." Some generals smiled dutifully. Others, exhausted and worried, couldn't manage it. This wasn't a time for cheerfulness. This was a time for desperate measures. The strategic situation Eisenhower described was grim. German forces had penetrated up to 50 miles in some sectors. The shoulders of the penetration were holding, barely, but the center was a chaotic mess of surrounded units and advancing German armor. Intelligence estimates suggested the Germans had committed most of their remaining strategic reserve to this offensive. That's which meant either they thought they could win, or they were gambling everything on one desperate throw. The immediate question was where to commit Allied reserves. Montgomery wanted all forces north of the breakthrough placed under his command. Bradley wanted to maintain American command of American forces. The debate was getting heated when Eisenhower cut it off. The question wasn't who commanded. The question was who could counterattack fastest. That's when he turned to Patton and asked the question that would define both men's legacies. "When can you attack?" Patton's answer came without hesitation. December 22nd, with 3 divisions. The room went silent. General Devers audibly gasped. Bradley's face showed anger mixed with disbelief. December 22nd was 3 days away. Though Patton was claiming he could disengage his army from its current offensive, move it 90 degrees north, and attack into the flank of the German penetration in 72 hours. Every officer in the room knew this was impossible. Military doctrine said such movements required weeks of planning. Patton was describing something that had never been done. Bradley thought Patton was showboating, playing to Eisenhower's desperation with promises he couldn't keep. Others thought Patton had finally let his ego override his judgment. Only Eisenhower studied Patton's face and saw not bravado, but calculation. Eisenhower asked quietly, "Are you serious?" Patton replied, "I am." Eisenhower decided in that moment to trust him. The private conversation after the meeting revealed Patton's actual thinking. Behind closed doors, away from other generals, Patton explained to Eisenhower that the movement north had already begun. He'd ordered it on December 18th, giving himself 96 hours, not 72. The 3 divisions were 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry. They would attack toward Bastogne because Patton believed Bastogne was the critical point, the place where the German offensive would succeed or fail. Eisenhower asked how Patton could be so confident. Patton pulled out a map and showed him. Bastogne was a road hub. 7 roads converged there. If the Germans couldn't use those roads, their supply columns would have to detour through dirt tracks that winter weather had made impassable. Without supplies, the German offensive would stall regardless of how far the lead elements advanced. Take Bastogne or relieve Bastogne, and you break the German offensive. It was that simple. What Patton didn't explain to Eisenhower, what he may not have fully acknowledged even to himself, was the political dimension of his promise. Montgomery was arguing that American forces had failed, that British command was needed to restore the situation, that Eisenhower should effectively demote Bradley and place Montgomery in overall command. Patton's promise was a way to demonstrate American capability, to prove that American generals could respond as fast as British ones, to keep Third Army under American command. This wasn't just about military necessity. This was about national pride, about proving that American methods worked, about ensuring that when the war ended, America could claim it had saved itself rather than being saved by the British. Patton understood these political currents in ways that more straightforward generals didn't. His promise was as much performance as plan. The reaction from Patton's own staff when he returned from Verdun was mixed. Some were confident because they'd been planning this movement for days. Others were terrified because they understood how much could still go wrong. Colonel Koch, the intelligence officer whose warnings had started all of this, was quietly satisfied that his assessment had proven correct. Colonel Mueller, the logistics officer whose calculations made the movement possible, was too busy managing the ongoing movement to feel anything except exhausted focus. And the combat commanders, the colonels and lieutenant colonels, who would actually have to attack on December 22nd, were trying to figure out how they'd organize an offensive with units that were still scattered across 3 countries and wouldn't be fully assembled until hours before the attack. Eisenhower's decision to trust Patton was one of the most important command decisions of the European war, though it's rarely discussed that way. Eisenhower was under enormous pressure from multiple directions. Churchill was calling daily, worried that the German offensive might succeed. Roosevelt was demanding explanations for how American intelligence had missed this. His own staff was divided on what to do, and here was Patton, promising something that sounded impossible, asking to be trusted when the stakes couldn't be higher. Eisenhower could have said no. He could have demanded more conservative planning, more preparation, more certainty. Instead, he trusted Patton's track record, trusted the confidence in Patton's voice, and made a decision that would commit American forces to an offensive that might fail spectacularly. If Patton failed, Eisenhower's decision would be second-guessed forever. If Patton succeeded, well, that would prove that sometimes the impossible was just difficult. The promise Patton made at Verdun became legendary precisely because it seemed impossible. Military historians still debate whether it was brilliant or reckless. Some argue that Patton had no choice, that only an immediate counterattack could prevent German breakthrough to the Meuse River. Others suggest that a more methodical approach would have achieved the same result with fewer casualties. What's certain is that Patton's promise changed the psychology of the entire Allied High Command. Before Verdun, the mood was defensive, reactive, worried. After Verdun, there was a plan. Someone was attacking. The initiative wouldn't belong entirely to the Germans. This psychological shift mattered as much as the military reality. Wars are fought in the minds of commanders as much as on battlefields, and Patton's promise, whether he could keep it or not, changed what Allied commanders believed was possible. December 19th, afternoon. Patton exited the conference to find his staff waiting anxiously for news. He told them simply, "I've just made a promise to the Supreme Commander. Now we have to keep it." This sentence captured everything about Patton's approach to command. He made promises first and figured out how to keep them second. And he believed that impossible promises created the pressure that forced organizations to achieve the impossible. A more cautious general would have checked with his staff before making promises to Eisenhower. Patton made the promise, then trusted his staff to make it real. This was either genius or madness, depending on whether it worked. In 72 hours, everyone would know which. The hours after Verdun were the most critical of the entire operation. Movement orders that had been theoretical now became operational. Units still fighting in the Saar received firm orders to disengage. Logistics staff finalized supply allocations for an offensive nobody had fully planned yet. Intelligence officers tried to figure out what Third Army would actually be attacking into. And Patton himself spent those hours doing what he did best, radiating confidence, visiting units when he could, making sure everyone understood that failure wasn't acceptable because he'd promised success. Whether he actually believed success was certain, or whether he was simply performing confidence is impossible to know. With Patton, the line between genuine belief and calculated performance was always blurred. What mattered was that his confidence was contagious, and in December 1944, contagious confidence was what Third Army needed most. December 19th, 1944, late afternoon, Bastogne, Belgium. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe arrived in Bastogne to find organized chaos slowly collapsing into disorganized panic. As acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, McAuliffe had been ordered to hold this town until relieved. The problem was that nobody seemed to know what they were holding it from, or how long relief might take. American units were streaming through Bastogne in retreat, Some still organized, others reduced to scattered groups of exhausted men who'd been fighting for 3 days straight. German forces were advancing from multiple directions, and Bastogne itself was just a small Belgian market town that none of the American defenders had even heard of 72 hours earlier. McAuliffe's first job was establishing a defensive perimeter before German forces could simply walk into an undefended town. His second job was convincing retreating units to stay and fight rather than continuing their withdrawal west. Neither job was going well. The 101st Airborne had been resting in France when the German offensive began, recovering from the brutal fight in Holland during Operation Market Garden. The division was understrength, missing equipment, filled with green replacements. When the call came to move to the Ardennes, the paratroopers had maybe 6 hours' notice. They packed what they could carry, loaded onto trucks, and drove through the night toward a battle they didn't understand. Most didn't even know where Bastogne was. They arrived to find a situation that matched nothing in their training. Airborne units were supposed to jump behind enemy lines, complete specific objectives, and be relieved quickly. They weren't supposed to defend towns indefinitely against armored attacks, but there was nobody else available, and Bastogne needed defending. And so the paratroopers improvised with the combination of skill and desperation that characterized American forces throughout this battle. Attached to the 101st Airborne were elements of the 10th Armored Division, organized into 3 task forces with names that would become legendary: Team Cherry, Team O'Hara, Team Désabris. These were combined arms teams of tanks, tank destroyers, and armored infantry, each commanded by a lieutenant colonel, and each responsible for defending a section of the perimeter. The tankers weren't happy about being attached to airborne command. The paratroopers weren't sure they wanted tankers who might attract German armor, but the combination worked because both groups were professional enough to put aside inter-service rivalry when survival was at stake. Team Cherry deployed east of Bastogne. Team O'Hara went south. Team Désabris headed north. And between them, they created a thin shell of armor that was the only thing standing between Bastogne and German occupation. December the 20th, morning, German forces tested the defenses for the first time. Reconnaissance elements probed from the east, expecting to find Bastogne evacuated or held by rear echelon troops. Instead, they encountered dug-in paratroopers supported by tank destroyers. The firefight was sharp and short. Germans withdrew, surprised, and reported back to higher command that Bastogne was held in strength. This was the first critical moment, though nobody recognized it at the time. If the Germans had attacked immediately with full force, they might have overwhelmed the still organizing defense. Instead, they paused to bring up reinforcements, giving the Americans precious hours to improve positions, register artillery, and establish communication networks. German caution, born from months of fighting Americans and learning to respect their defensive capabilities, bought time that would prove invaluable. The supply situation was desperate from the beginning. The 101st had deployed so rapidly that they'd left most of their heavy equipment behind. Paratroopers had rifles and light machine guns, but no artillery beyond what they could borrow. Medical supplies were minimal. Food was whatever they'd carried in their packs. And ammunition for the attached armor was limited to what the tanks carried in their internal racks. Officers calculated they had supplies for maybe 2 or 3 days of sustained combat. After that, they'd be fighting with whatever they could capture from the Germans. This created a perverse strategic situation where the defenders hoped the Germans would attack just hard enough to be defeated, but not so hard that repelling them would exhaust the ammunition supply. Every shot fired was one less shot available for future attacks. Rationing began immediately. December the 21st brought the first major German assault. Elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the east, supported by assault guns. The fighting was brutal and close. Team Cherry, defending the eastern approaches, found itself in a desperate battle for survival. German infantry infiltrated between American positions in the pre-dawn darkness. Tank destroyers engaged assault guns at ranges so close that crews could see each other through vision ports. By noon, Team Cherry's line had broken. Survivors fell back into Bastogne, having bought time but lost positions. The perimeter contracted. German forces were now within artillery range of the town center, and everyone in Bastogne understood that this was just the beginning. that the Germans were bringing up more forces and that the next attack would be heavier. The famous surrender ultimatum arrived on December 22nd. German officers approached under a white flag with a formal demand for capitulation. The message was classic German military formality. Resistance was pointless, the situation hopeless. Surrender now to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. And McAuliffe's response has become one of the most famous in American military history. Nuts. One word. When the German officers asked for clarification, American officers explained that it meant, "Go to hell." The exchange gets remembered as heroic defiance, which it was, but it was also tactical calculation. McAuliffe knew that negotiating surrender would destroy his soldiers' will to fight. Better to refuse bluntly and let the Germans draw their own conclusions. The psychological warfare was as important as the military defense. If the Germans believed Americans would surrender when the situation became untenable, they might pause before attacking, giving defenders more time. If they believed Americans would fight to the end, they might commit more forces than they could afford. By December 22nd dawn, and men on the Bastogne perimeter could hear artillery in the distance to the south, different from the German guns firing at them. American guns firing steadily, getting louder. Some soldiers said, "Maybe it's Patton." The rumor spread through foxholes faster than any official communication. Patton was coming. Third Army was attacking north. Relief was on the way. Nobody knew if it was true. Nobody knew how long it might take. But the rumor changed everything. Soldiers who'd been calculating whether they could survive another day suddenly started calculating whether they could survive until relief arrived. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Hope, even uncertain hope, was a weapon more powerful than any rifle. Men who had been preparing to die fighting started preparing to live long enough to be rescued. The medical situation in Bastogne revealed the human cost in ways that tactical reports couldn't capture. The division aid station, located in the cellars of a Bastogne church, was overwhelmed within 48 hours. Over 500 casualties by December 21st, with only limited supplies and no possibility of evacuation. Surgeons performed amputations by candlelight. Morphine ran out, forcing medics to choose who got pain relief and who had to endure wounds without it. The cold was almost as dangerous as German fire. Wounded men went into shock faster in freezing temperatures. Infections spread rapidly in conditions where sterilization was impossible. And the doctors knew that every casualty they couldn't evacuate was a man who would die if the defense failed. That's because the Germans weren't going to provide medical care to American wounded. This knowledge drove surgeons and medics to work beyond exhaustion, trying to keep men alive through a siege whose end date nobody could predict. The weather that saved Bastogne also endangered it. Heavy fog and low clouds prevented German air attack, which was critical because the Luftwaffe still had strike capability in December 1944. But the same weather prevented American resupply and close air support. Defenders could hear C-47 transport planes circling above the cloud layer, but unable to drop supplies accurately. When planes tried to drop through clouds, supplies drifted into German lines or landed too far from American positions to retrieve. The frustration of watching parachutes float into enemy territory. By knowing that food and ammunition you desperately needed was landing where Germans would capture it, was psychologically devastating. By December 24th, the defenders of Bastogne understood they were alone in a way that soldiers rarely experience in modern war. No air support, no resupply, no evacuation. Just the certainty that help was supposedly coming and the terrible uncertainty of whether it would arrive in time. December the 22nd, 1944, 0600 hours. The artillery barrage that opened 4th Armored Division's attack north sounded different from what German defenders had heard before. American artillery in December 1944 had achieved a level of coordination that made it the most lethal in the world. Forward observers called coordinates. As fire direction centers calculated trajectories. Gun crews loaded and fired in rhythms perfected through months of combat. The shells fell in patterns designed not just to kill, but to terrorize, to shatter German defensive positions before American tanks even started moving. For 15 minutes, high explosive rained on German positions around the town of Martelange. Then the barrage lifted. Morning fog turned red with the glow of burning buildings. And through that fog came the Shermans of 4th Armored Division, advancing toward Bastogne with all the speed and violence that American doctrine could generate. This wasn't a dash. This was the beginning of a fighting advance that would take 4 days to cover 12 miles. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at the tip of 4th Armored's advance. Abrams was the kind of officer who led from the front, whose command tank was usually the first to make contact with the enemy. His briefing to his company commanders that morning was characteristically blunt. "Today we go into Bastogne, or we don't come back." Everyone understood this wasn't motivational rhetoric. It was tactical reality. 4th Armored had been ordered to break through to Bastogne, regardless of casualties, regardless of obstacles, regardless of anything except failure. The attack had to succeed because Patton had promised it would succeed, and Patton's promise had committed not just 4th Armored, but the entire 3rd Army to an operation that would be judged successful or failed, based on whether these tanks reached Bastogne. The weight of that expectation was crushing. But Abrams and his battalion were veterans who'd fought across France. They knew how to translate pressure into violence. Martelange was the first serious obstacle. A small town on the Shore River, defended by German paratroopers who'd had 3 days to prepare positions. The bridge across the river had been demolished, leaving a 30-foot gap that no tank could cross. 4th Armored's advance stopped at the riverbank while engineers came forward to construct a Bailey Bridge under fire. This was the tactical problem that would repeat itself constantly during the advance to Bastogne. German forces weren't trying to stop 4th Armored. They were trying to delay it. Blow bridges, mine roads, establish strong points in villages, force the Americans to deploy, assault, reorganize, and continue. Each delay was cumulative. Each hour spent clearing a village was an hour that men in Bastogne were dying. And the Germans understood this perfectly, which is why they fought delay actions with a skill and determination that multiplied the impact of their limited forces. The Bailey Bridge at Martelange took 11 hours to complete. Engineers worked under sporadic German artillery fire, knowing that every mistake would cost time they didn't have. The bridge components were heavy steel sections that had to be assembled in sequence, each piece locked to the previous one, the whole structure cantilevered across the gap until it could rest on both banks. One section slipped during installation, crashed into the river, had to be recovered and repositioned. When the bridge was finally complete, and it was tested with an empty Sherman that crossed slowly while everyone held their breath, praying the structure would hold. It did. The advance resumed, but 11 hours had been lost, and Bastogne was still 12 miles away. At this rate, 4th Armored would reach Bastogne sometime in 1945. December 23rd brought the weather change that everyone had been praying for. Morning fog lifted, clouds broke, sunlight illuminated the battlefield for the first time in a week. Within minutes, American fighter bombers appeared, P-47 Thunderbolts carrying 500-pound bombs and rockets. They worked in pairs, one aircraft marking targets while the second attacked. German positions that had been invisible in fog were suddenly exposed. Strong points that infantry would have needed hours to reduce were destroyed in minutes. The psychological impact on German defenders was severe. For days they'd fought under cloud cover that protected them from American air superiority. Now the sky belonged to the enemy again, and there was nowhere to hide. Prisoners taken that afternoon spoke of terror from the sky, of watching rockets streak down from aircraft they could barely see, of entire positions disappearing in explosions that left nothing but craters. But air support couldn't solve the fundamental problem of terrain and determined defenders. The approach to Bastogne ran through rolling hills covered in thick forest, intersected by rivers and streams, dotted with stone villages that became fortresses when defended. Every ridge offered German observers positions to call artillery. Every village required house-to-house fighting. Every stream meant another blown bridge and another delay. 4th Armored was advancing through terrain that favored the defender absolutely, against an enemy who'd had time to prepare, with a deadline that made caution impossible. The combination guaranteed casualties. By midday December 23rd, 4th Armored had lost 17 tanks and over 300 men. They'd advanced 4 miles. 8 miles remained to Bastogne. The mathematics were brutal and simple. At this rate, they had arrived too late. Chaumont became the critical battle, a village 3 miles south of Bastogne, held by German assault guns and infantry from the 5th Parachute Division. 4th Armored reached Chaumont on December 24th and found Germans dug in behind stone walls, in cellars, in positions that turned the entire village into a defensive position. The attack went in at dawn. Shermans advancing down narrow streets where German Panzerfausts could hit from upper windows or cellars. Infantry fighting house to house, clearing rooms with grenades and rifle fire, taking casualties from defenders who'd prepared fields of fire covering every approach. Abrams's command tank took 3 hits from a German assault gun before American tank destroyers could locate and destroy the enemy vehicle. The fighting lasted 6 hours. When it ended, Chaumont was American, but 4th Armored had lost another 14 tanks and 200 men, and Bastogne was still 8 miles away. The casualty rates were staggering even by World War II standards. The 4th Armored Division started the relief operation with 177 medium tanks. By December 24th evening, 31 had been destroyed, and another 20 were disabled with mechanical problems or damage requiring depot-level repair. Infantry battalions that had begun the attack at 70% strength were now down to 50%. Company commanders were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains with weeks of combat experience were stepping into command of battalions because all the field-grade officers were casualties, and the men who remained were exhausted beyond anything training had prepared them for, fighting continuously for 3 days, minimal sleep, constant stress, the knowledge that friends were dying and the attacks had to continue anyway. December 24th evening brought the moment of maximum despair. 4th Armored's lead elements were 8 miles from Bastogne, but stalled against German positions that showed no sign of breaking. Inside Bastogne, artillery officers were down to 10 rounds per gun. 4th Armored's own ammunition stocks were running low from 3 days of continuous combat. And intelligence reports indicated that German forces were preparing a major assault on Bastogne for Christmas Day. The race had become unbearably clear. Could 4th Armored cover 8 miles before Bastogne's ammunition ran out? Could Bastogne hold one more day against a major assault? The questions had no certain answers. Officers made decisions based on hope rather than calculation, because calculation suggested that failure was the most likely outcome. And Patton visited 4th Armored's command post on the evening of December 24th. He spoke with Abrams and other battalion commanders, reviewed casualty figures, studied maps showing German positions between 4th Armored and Bastogne. Then he wrote in his diary that night, "I hope to God I haven't promised more than I can deliver." This was extraordinary. Patton never admitted doubt, never showed uncertainty, never acknowledged that his confidence might be performance rather than conviction. But on Christmas Eve 1944, staring at maps that showed 8 miles as an unbridgeable distance, even Patton couldn't maintain the facade of certainty. He'd promised relief by December 22nd. It was now December 24th, and relief seemed as far away as ever. The men of 4th Armored had done everything asked of them, and more. They'd advanced under impossible conditions, taken casualties that would have broken lesser units, maintained attacks when every tactical consideration suggested they should pause and reorganize. And it still wasn't enough. The final irony of December 24th was that inside Bastogne, defenders had no idea how close relief actually was. They could hear artillery to the south, could see American aircraft attacking German positions, could sense that something was happening. But they had no communication with 4th Armored, no way to know that tanks were 8 miles away and fighting desperately to close that final distance. Some men in Bastogne convinced themselves that relief would arrive by Christmas morning. Others believed they had been abandoned. That Patton's promised relief was propaganda meant to keep them fighting, while higher command wrote them off as acceptable losses. The truth was somewhere between these extremes. Relief was coming. Whether it would arrive in time was a question that nobody, not Patton, not Abrams, not McAuliffe, could answer with any certainty. War had become a race against time, and time was winning. December 24th, 1944, morning, Bastogne. Artillery officer Captain James Evans stood in the frozen ruins of a Belgian barn and did mathematics that determined whether men would live or die. His battalion had started the siege with a normal ammunition allocation, enough for several days of sustained fire. Now, after 5 days of defensive combat, he had 10 rounds per gun. 10. It's against German divisions that were preparing what prisoners claimed would be a major Christmas assault. Evans calculated firing rates in his head. If the Germans attacked in battalion strength, his guns could support maybe one defensive barrage before running dry. After that, the infantry would be on their own, fighting German armor with rifles and whatever bazookas still had rockets. He reported the ammunition situation to division headquarters and received the order he expected and dreaded. Fire only when you can see targets. Every round had to count because there would be no resupply until the siege was lifted, and nobody knew when that might be. Inside the church that served as the division aid station, surgeons were performing a different kind of calculation. 500 wounded men crowded into spaces designed for maybe 50. And medical supplies essentially exhausted, morphine gone, sulfa drugs running out, bandages being washed and reused because there were no clean ones. And outside, German artillery continued to create new casualties faster than existing casualties could be treated. The chief surgeon, Major Douglas Davidson, had stopped trying to save everyone. Instead, he triaged ruthlessly. Men who would probably survive with minimal treatment got that treatment. Men who would probably die regardless of treatment got nothing except whatever comfort could be provided. And men who might survive with intensive care received that care only if supplies allowed. This was medicine reduced to pure utilitarianism, and it haunted every doctor and medic who practiced it. They'd taken oaths to save lives. Now they were rationing who got the chance to live. In December 24th noon, brought the aerial resupply drop that would become one of the iconic images of the siege. 241 C-47 transport aircraft flying in formation through clear skies, German anti-aircraft fire rising to meet them, parachutes blossoming in red, white, blue, and yellow as supplies fell toward Bastogne. Defenders watched from foxholes and cheered, the first moment of genuine hope since the siege began. The drop was remarkably accurate. 95% of supplies landed in American lines, a dramatic improvement over previous attempts in fog when most supplies had drifted into German positions. Parachutes carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and winter clothing fell like colored snow across the perimeter. Men ran to collect containers while German artillery tried to target the drop zones. For a few hours, Bastogne's supply situation transformed from desperate to merely critical. But inside 4th Armored Division's sector, the mood was darker. Colonel Wendell Blanchard, commanding a tank battalion, submitted his after-action report showing his unit at 40% effective strength. He'd lost 60% of his tanks and men in 3 days of fighting. His remaining crews were so exhausted they were falling asleep during brief halts, so cold that some had frostbite serious enough to require evacuation, if evacuation had been possible. Blanchard recommended halting the advance to allow units to reorganize, rest, and integrate replacement equipment. His recommendation was denied. The attack would continue regardless of unit readiness, because stopping meant accepting that Bastogne might fall. The decision to continue attacking units that could barely function reflected the desperation that had seized Third Army's command. They were committed now, beyond the point where rational military planning allowed withdrawal. Success or catastrophic failure were the only options remaining. Third Army headquarters received Blanchard's report, along with similar reports from other battalion commanders. Patton studied the casualty figures and wrote in his diary, "The butcher's bill is getting high." This was characteristic Patton understatement. 4th Armored had taken over 1,500 casualties in 3 days, losses that equated to an entire regiment destroyed. 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, attacking on 4th Armored's flanks, had suffered comparable casualties. A Third Army was losing men faster than the replacement system could provide trained soldiers, and everyone knew that even if they reached Bastogne, the battle wouldn't end. The corridor would have to be held, widened, defended against German counterattacks. The casualties already suffered were just the down payment on a battle that might continue for weeks. Christmas Eve brought an unofficial truce in some sectors that military histories rarely mention. Along parts of the line where Americans and Germans were close enough to hear each other, men began singing Christmas carols. Silent Night in German from one tree line. Silent Night in English from the opposing tree line. For a few hours, the shooting stopped. Men remembered they were human beings celebrating the same holiday, worshiping the same God, wanting the same thing, all to survive and go home. The truces were local, unauthorized, and temporary. By midnight, the shooting resumed. But those few hours of shared humanity revealed something that the tactical situation obscured. Most men fighting this battle didn't hate each other. They were trapped in a system that demanded they kill each other, and they complied because compliance was the only way to survive. The tragedy wasn't that men fought. The tragedy was that the fighting had become so normalized that a few hours of peace felt miraculous. Inside Bastogne, Christmas Eve services were held in cellars, in aid stations, in foxholes. Chaplains moved through the perimeter, conducting brief ceremonies for men who couldn't leave their positions. The services were short, stripped of ceremony, reduced to essential messages about faith and survival and hope. Attendance was higher than any previous religious service during the war. Men who'd never attended services came because Christmas Eve in a surrounded town facing a possible German assault felt like a moment when God's presence was needed absolutely. The chaplain spoke about deliverance, about faith in dark times, about the belief that morning would come. Whether they believed their own messages or were simply providing comfort they no longer felt personally is impossible to know. But the services mattered because they gave men something beyond military discipline to cling to. Faith that relief would come. Faith that survival was possible. Faith that this suffering had meaning. Mail delivery to Third Army that day brought Christmas packages from home, adding surreal normalcy to a situation that was anything but normal. Soldiers opened packages in foxholes under fire, cookies baked by mothers who had no idea their sons were fighting in Belgium, warm socks knitted by wives who couldn't know that their husbands' feet were already frostbitten, letters written in early December describing peaceful life in American towns, where the war was something that happened on newsreels, not in lived experience. The disconnect between the contents of these packages and the reality of the battlefield was psychologically destabilizing. Men read letters from loved ones asking about holiday plans while sitting in frozen mud, surrounded by corpses. The packages were meant to boost morale. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they made men realize how completely their families couldn't understand what they were experiencing, creating a sense of isolation more profound than physical encirclement. Midnight, December 24th. In Bastogne, men counted down to Christmas in foxholes, wondering if they'd survive to see December 26th. In 4th Armored Sector, tank crews tried to sleep inside their Shermans because it was marginally warmer than outside, though still below freezing. At 3rd Army headquarters, staff officers updated maps showing minimal progress, calculated casualty rates, and tried to determine whether the relief effort could possibly succeed. And in German headquarters, commanders prepared orders for Christmas Day assaults designed to crush Bastogne before American relief could arrive. 4 armies, hundreds of thousands of men, all focused on a small Belgian town that most had never heard of a week earlier. The concentration of violence and suffering in such a small geographic area was almost medieval in its intensity. Modern war, with its global reach and strategic complexity, had contracted to a single point, and everything that happened next would radiate outward from whatever transpired in the next 48 hours. The Christmas Eve of 1944 would be remembered by survivors as the darkest moment of the Battle of the Bulge. Not because the military situation was objectively worse than other moments, but because the emotional toll of fighting on Christmas, of being cold and hungry and surrounded while families at home celebrated, was uniquely devastating. War doesn't pause for holidays. Suffering doesn't respect sacred days. And the men who experienced Christmas Eve 1944 in the Ardennes learned that there are some experiences that permanently separate those who lived through them from those who didn't. You could tell someone about being surrounded at Christmas. You could describe the cold and fear and exhaustion, but you couldn't make them understand what it felt like to sing Christmas carols while wondering if you'd be alive to sing them again next year. That understanding belonged only to those who'd lived it. December 20th, 1944, evening, headquarters. 47 Panzer Corps. General Heinrich von Luttwitz studied a map that presented him with an impossible command problem. His corps, the 47th Panzer Corps, was the primary German formation responsible for taking Bastogne, and his orders from 5th Panzer Army headquarters were clear and contradictory. Secure Bastogne to protect supply lines, but also bypass Bastogne to maintain momentum toward the Meuse River. The military impossibility of doing both simultaneously was obvious to any trained officer. Bastogne couldn't be secured without committing substantial forces to siege operations, but those same forces were needed for the advance west. Luttwitz had fought on the Eastern Front, where contradictory orders from higher headquarters were normal, where officers learned to interpret intent rather than follow literal instructions. But this situation was different. Both objectives were genuinely critical. Failing at either one could doom the entire offensive, and he lacked the forces to guarantee success at both. And the decision to send a surrender ultimatum to Bastogne on December 21st reflected German confidence that was rapidly becoming delusion. Luttwitz authorized the ultimatum because he genuinely believed American forces would surrender when confronted with their hopeless situation. The German military tradition emphasized rational decision-making. A surrounded force with no supply, no reinforcement, and no escape should surrender to avoid pointless casualties. That's what German officers would do in similar circumstances. Luttwitz expected American officers to reach the same rational conclusion. McAuliffe's response, "Nuts," revealed a cultural difference that German commanders consistently underestimated. American forces didn't always behave rationally in German terms. They held positions that doctrine said were untenable. They counterattacked when prudence suggested defense, and they refused surrender demands that any European army would have accepted. This cultural gap would prove decisive. December the 22nd brought Hitler's direct intervention, which transformed tactical problems into strategic disasters. The Führer, following the battle from his headquarters, became fixated on Bastogne as the key to the entire offensive. He ordered Luttwitz to take the town at all costs, while simultaneously denying him the strategic reserves needed to ensure success. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was assigned to reduce Bastogne, but the panzer divisions that should have supported them were held back for the advance west. This division of forces satisfied nobody and weakened everything. The 26th Volksgrenadier fought hard, but lacked the firepower to crack prepared defenses. The panzer divisions advanced west, but found their supply lines vulnerable because Bastogne remained in American hands. German military efficiency was being destroyed by command decisions that prioritized Hitler's intuition over tactical reality. Oberst Hans Kochotz commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and faced an impossible tactical situation. His division was ordered to take Bastogne, but lacked artillery support, air support, or armored reinforcement sufficient for the mission. His attacks on December 22nd and 23rd were piecemeal, thrown in where opportunity seemed to exist rather than coordinated to maximize effect. This wasn't incompetence. It was the inevitable result of trying to execute division-level operations without division-level resources. Kochotz's infantry fought well, advancing under fire, taking casualties, occasionally penetrating American defenses. But every penetration was temporary because Kochotz lacked the follow-on forces to exploit success. American defenders learned they could yield ground temporarily, then counterattack to restore the line. The fighting was intense but ultimately indecisive, exactly the kind of attritional battle that favored the side with better logistics. And German logistics were already failing. The supply crisis was killing the German offensive more effectively than American resistance. Hitler's plan assumed German forces would capture American fuel dumps to sustain their advance. This assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. American forces destroyed or evacuated supply dumps before the Germans could seize them. German panzers were running out of fuel 20 to 30 miles short of their objectives. Tank commanders reported finding American supply dumps that had been burned hours before their arrival. The frustration was maddening. You could see the supplies you needed going up in smoke just beyond reach. By December 23rd, some German tank battalions were immobilized purely due to fuel shortage. The vehicles worked, the crews were ready. But without fuel, armor became stationary targets waiting for American fighter bombers to destroy them. December 23rd, Hitler's headquarters, brought the confrontation that revealed how completely the German command structure had broken down. General Hasse von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, all called Hitler directly to request permission to redirect forces from the western advance to crush Bastogne. Manteuffel was one of Germany's most skilled commanders, a veteran of the Eastern Front who understood mobile warfare better than almost anyone. His tactical judgment was that Bastogne had to be taken before the advance could continue. Hitler refused. The advance west would continue. Bastogne would fall when its garrison ran out of supplies. Manteuffel tried to explain that the Americans were being resupplied by air, that the garrison wasn't running out of supplies, that bypass strong points didn't surrender automatically. Hitler dismissed these concerns. His will would overcome logistics. Faith in victory would triumph over material reality. The conversation ended with Manteuffel understanding that rational military planning had been replaced by magical thinking. The competition between 5th Panzer Army and 6th SS Panzer Army undermined whatever coordination remained in German operations. Both armies were advancing west, theoretically supporting each other. In practice, they competed for resources, for Hitler's favor, for the prestige of reaching the Meuse first. Josef Dietrich commanded 6th SS Panzer Army and enjoyed Hitler's personal favor despite limited military skill. Manteuffel commanded 5th Panzer Army and possessed genuine military talent but less political influence. When both armies needed reinforcements, Dietrich got priority. When both needed fuel, SS units got theirs first. This favoritism would have damaged German effectiveness even in a successful offensive. In a failing offensive, it was catastrophic. Units that should have been supporting each other were instead competing with each other, and the Americans were the beneficiaries of this dysfunction. German soldiers in the field were beginning to recognize what their commanders wouldn't acknowledge. The offensive had failed. Prisoners captured after December 23rd spoke of low morale, fuel shortages, supply problems. They described watching American aircraft destroy supply columns, watching tanks run out of fuel and being abandoned, watching promised reinforcements fail to arrive. Some expressed fatalism. They had known the offensive was Germany's last chance. Now that it was failing, they understood the war was effectively over. That these weren't defeatists or cowards. These were veterans who'd fought across Europe and Russia. They could read tactical situations. And the situation around Bastogne told them that Germany had gambled everything on this offensive and lost. December 24th, German commanders around Bastogne prepared for what they knew would be a final major assault. Orders came down from 5th Panzer Army: take Bastogne on Christmas Day or abandon the siege to consolidate forces for defense against the American counteroffensive that intelligence indicated was building. This was effectively an ultimatum from higher command. Succeed tomorrow or admit failure. Officers prepared their units for an all-out assault, knowing that this was the last chance. Kokot's infantry would attack from multiple directions simultaneously. What armor could be scraped together would support the attack. Artillery that should have been supporting the advance west was redirected to Bastogne for one massive bombardment. Every reserve was committed. It was a gambler's final bet, throwing everything on one more roll of the dice because admitting defeat was psychologically impossible. The German perspective on Bastogne reveals how strategic miscalculation compounds tactical failures. Bastogne should never have become the decisive battle. It was supposed to be a waypoint, a logistics hub that would fall automatically as the offensive swept past. Instead, it became a siege that consumed forces needed elsewhere, that delayed operations beyond recovery, that demonstrated to German soldiers that their commanders no longer understood the reality they were fighting in. Luttwitz, Kokot, and Manteuffel all were competent officers trying to execute an incoherent plan handed down from a leader who'd lost touch with military reality. Their tragedy was that they understood they were failing, but lacked the political authority to change course. They could only execute orders they knew were flawed and hope that somehow, impossibly, Hitler's will would overcome logistics, weather, and American determination. By Christmas Eve, even that hope was fading. December 18th, 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Staff officers gathered around a large-scale map of the Ardennes, trying to understand a battle that was evolving faster than intelligence could track it. Initial reports had shown German attacks across the entire front. Now, 48 hours later, patterns were emerging. The German advance wasn't uniform. Some sectors had penetrated deeply, others had stalled, and in the center of the map, a small town called Bastogne was becoming a focal point for reasons nobody had initially understood. Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, studied road networks and realized what the Germans had probably planned. Bastogne controlled 7 paved roads radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. In summer, this wouldn't matter much. Armies could move cross-country. But in winter, with snow and mud making unpaved routes impassable to heavy vehicles, those 7 roads became critical arteries. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the central Ardennes. Strong circled the town on the map and said quietly, "Next, this is where the battle will be decided." The strategic importance of Bastogne wasn't obvious on December 16th. It was just one of many towns threatened by the German offensive. But by December 20th, after American forces had held it for several days and German forces had failed to take it quickly, Bastogne's importance had multiplied exponentially. Every hour the town remained in American hands was an hour that German supply columns had to detour around it, adding miles to their routes, consuming fuel they couldn't afford to waste. German logistics planners calculated that bypassing Bastogne forced supply trucks to travel 3 times the distance they would have traveled, using the direct roads through town. This arithmetic mattered absolutely in an offensive that was already outrunning its supply lines. And Bastogne had transformed from objective to obstacle, from a place to take to a place whose mere existence was disrupting German operations. December 22nd, ultra-intercepts provided the intelligence that transformed Allied understanding of the battle. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading high-level German communications throughout the offensive. Now they provided decrypts showing that German logistics were in crisis. Fuel tankers couldn't reach forward units. Supply dumps were empty. Tank battalions were reporting immobilization due to fuel shortage. The intercepts revealed something else crucial. German commanders were arguing about Bastogne. Some wanted to commit everything to taking it. Others wanted to bypass it entirely. The disagreement at German high command showed that Bastogne had become psychologically important beyond its tactical value. It had become a symbol of the offensive's success or failure. If Germany couldn't take one surrounded town, defended by one American division, how could they possibly reach the Meuse River and Antwerp? Allied strategic planners began gaming out scenarios on December 23rd. What if Bastogne fell? The Germans would have their road network. Supply would flow more efficiently. The advance west might resume. American forces would lose a significant psychological victory, and the corridor of German penetration would widen, potentially splitting Allied armies and creating the strategic crisis Hitler wanted. But what if Bastogne held? German logistics would remain disrupted. Thus, the offensive would stall for lack of supplies even if the lead elements continued advancing, and American forces would have a defended position deep in the German rear from which to launch counterattacks. The scenarios made clear that Bastogne's significance was growing daily. What had started as a tactical problem had become a strategic hinge on which the entire battle might turn. The Soviet calculation added another dimension to Bastogne's importance that Americans rarely considered. Stalin's staff analyzed the Battle of the Bulge through the lens of their own offensive planning. They were preparing a major winter offensive in the east, timed to begin in January. The longer Germany remained focused on the Ardennes, the fewer forces would be available to oppose the Soviet attack. Then Bastogne's prolonged defense served Soviet interests perfectly by keeping German reserves committed in the west. When Churchill and Roosevelt discussed the battle, Soviet advantage was part of their strategic calculation. If Bastogne fell quickly, Germany might be able to redirect forces east. If it held, those forces would remain committed until the Soviet offensive made their position irrelevant. Bastogne's fate wasn't just an American concern. It was affecting strategic calculations across 3 Allied capitals and fundamentally shaping how the war would end. political considerations elevated Bastogne's importance beyond pure military calculation. American newspapers were calling the German offensive the worst defeat since Pearl Harbor. Public opinion was shocked that Germany, supposedly beaten, could launch such a powerful attack. And Roosevelt faced questions about whether the war had been mismanaged. Churchill faced pressure from British military chiefs who wanted more British command authority over American forces. Eisenhower faced the possibility of being relieved if he couldn't restore the situation. In this political environment, Bastogne became symbolically crucial. If American forces could hold a surrounded town against everything Germany could throw at it, the narrative changed from American defeat to American resilience. The propaganda value of Bastogne's defense was immense, which is why McAuliffe's nuts response resonated so powerfully. It was defiance that the American public desperately wanted to see. December 25th, strategic reassessments across Allied headquarters reached similar conclusions. Germany had committed approximately 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks to the Ardennes offensive. Intelligence estimated this represented Germany's entire strategic reserve in the West. If these forces could be destroyed or severely damaged in the Ardennes, Germany would lack the strength to defend against subsequent Allied offensives. In other words, Hitler's gamble had created an opportunity. By committing everything to one offensive, he'd made it possible for the Allies to destroy Germany's defensive capability in one battle. But only if the Allied response was effective. Only if Bastogne held long enough for American counterattacks to develop. Only if German forces could be fixed in place and then crushed. Bastogne was the pin that held German forces in position, while Allied power concentrated for the counterstroke. The road network analysis that Strong had conducted on December 18th was proven correct by events. German columns attempting to bypass Bastogne found themselves on narrow dirt roads that turned to mud under heavy traffic. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks couldn't get through. What should have been hours-long movements took days. Meanwhile, American forces using the roads through Bastogne could move at normal speeds because paved roads remained passable even in winter weather. This mobility differential meant American reinforcements reached the battlefield faster than German reinforcements. Fresh American divisions arrived at the shoulders of the German penetration before German reserves could exploit their initial success. The battle was becoming a race to concentrate forces, and the side that controlled the road network was winning that race. Comparative analysis with other battles revealed Bastogne's unique characteristics. It wasn't Stalingrad, where an entire army was encircled and destroyed. It wasn't Tobruk, where a garrison held out for months. Bastogne was something different, a tactical position whose strategic value increased the longer it was defended. Each day Bastogne held was a day German operations became more disrupted. The defenders didn't have to destroy German forces. They just had to continue existing, to remain a defended position that German supply columns couldn't use, and German attack formations couldn't ignore. This passive resistance had active strategic consequences that multiplied over time. By December 26th, when 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, the town's strategic value had reached its peak. It had served as a breakwater against which the German offensive had crashed and broken. It had disrupted enemy logistics beyond repair. It had provided a focal point for American resistance when resistance seemed impossible. And it had demonstrated to German commanders, to Allied publics, and to the soldiers fighting that American forces could absorb a massive surprise attack and not just survive, but counterattack effectively. The relief of Bastogne wasn't the end of the Battle of the Bulge, but it was the moment when everyone knew how the battle would end. Germany had thrown everything into this offensive. They'd failed to break through, and now they would pay the price for that failure. Bastogne mattered because it was the place where Hitler's last Western offensive died. It was where Germany's final strategic reserve was committed and defeated, where the road to Berlin became irreversible. December 23, 1944, 0800 hours, 3rd Army Headquarters. Colonel Don Zimmerman, Patton's meteorologist, delivered the forecast that everyone had been praying for. High pressure moving in from the west. Clouds breaking by mid-morning. Clear skies for at least 3 days. Patton's reaction was immediate. He ordered his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to compose a prayer for good weather and have it printed on cards for distribution to every soldier in Third Army. The prayer was simple: Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. O'Neill hesitated, uncertain whether it was appropriate to pray for weather favorable to killing. Patton was insistent. God was on their side. God would deliver clear skies. Whether Patton genuinely believed this or simply understood the psychological value of appearing to believe it was impossible to determine. What mattered was that by noon, 250,000 soldiers were carrying cards promising that God would give them clear weather, and by afternoon, God appeared to be delivering. 0900 hours, the first of 47 Thunderbolts took off from airfields in France and Luxembourg. Pilots who'd been grounded for a week climbed through thinning clouds into blue sky and sunlight. For the first time since December 16th, they could see the battlefield. What they saw was opportunity. German columns stretched across roads, visible from miles away. Supply trucks, tank formations, artillery batteries. Everything that should have been hidden under forest canopy was exposed because the Germans had stopped bothering with camouflage after a week of fog. Now, suddenly, the sky belonged to the enemy again, and German forces were caught completely exposed. The pilots radioed targets to ground controllers and began their attacks with an enthusiasm born from a week of forced inactivity. This wasn't precision bombing. This was target-rich opportunity. The scale of aerial operations on December 23rd was staggering. Over 1,500 Allied sorties, more than on most days during the Normandy campaign. Fighter bombers carried 500-pound bombs, rockets, and machine guns. Medium bombers struck German supply dumps and railroad junctions. Heavy bombers, normally reserved for strategic targets in Germany, were redirected to support ground operations. The air over the Ardennes became so crowded that mid-air collisions became a serious risk. Controllers struggled to manage traffic, directing formations to different sectors, stacking them at different altitudes, coordinating attacks so that one group's bombs didn't hit another group's aircraft. American air superiority had returned with a vengeance, and German forces that had advanced confidently under cloud cover now found themselves hunted from above. The resupply mission to Bastogne on December 23rd demonstrated how much difference weather made. 241 C-47 transport aircraft flew in tight formation, protected by fighter escorts that shot down the few German aircraft that attempted interception. With clear visibility, bombardiers could actually see Bastogne's perimeter and drop supplies accurately. Colored parachutes, red for ammunition, white for medical supplies, blue for food, yellow for gasoline, fell across the American positions in the most successful resupply operation of the siege. 95% accuracy compared to 30% during fog drops. The defenders watched with something approaching religious awe. One officer described it as watching colored snow fall from heaven. The supplies didn't just improve Bastogne's defensive capability, they improved morale by demonstrating that the besieged garrison wasn't abandoned, that the outside world knew they existed and was supporting them. German forces suffered terribly under the clear skies. Columns caught in the open had nowhere to hide. And American pilots reported shooting galleries and turkey shoots. One P-47 pilot described finding a German supply column stretched along a road for miles, vehicles bumper to bumper, and making multiple attack runs until his ammunition was exhausted. German casualties from air attack on December 23rd exceeded casualties from ground combat. Tank units that had survived 3 days of fighting were destroyed in minutes by aircraft they couldn't effectively fight. Anti-aircraft guns shot down some attackers, but the volume of American aircraft was overwhelming. For every plane lost, 10 more were available. The material superiority that the United States had built through years of industrial mobilization was expressing itself through complete aerial dominance. But the clear weather benefited the Germans in ways Allied planners hadn't fully considered. The Luftwaffe, which had been conserving aircraft during the fog, launched its own operations on December 23rd. German pilots flew ground support missions for units around Bastogne, attacked American supply columns, and generally reminded Allied forces that Germany still had an air force. The fighting in the air was brutal. American pilots accustomed to limited German resistance found themselves in genuine dogfights. Several P-47s were shot down. The Luftwaffe couldn't match American numbers, but it could contest the sky enough to make American air superiority expensive rather than free. This resistance demonstrated that Germany retained capability even in its weakest military domain. December 25th brought Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's surprise attack on Allied airfields. Over 900 German aircraft struck airfields across France, Belgium, and Holland at dawn. The attack was meticulously planned, using low-level approaches to avoid radar detection. American and British forces were caught completely by surprise. Aircraft parked in neat rows were strafed and destroyed on the ground. Over 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed, the highest one-day loss of the air campaign. The attack succeeded brilliantly at the tactical level, but strategically, it was catastrophic for Germany. The Luftwaffe lost 250 aircraft and, more critically, experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. Germany traded pilots for parked airplanes, an exchange that favored the side with better training programs and replacement capacity. Within days, while Allied air strength had recovered through replacement aircraft, German air strength never recovered, the pilots lost on Christmas morning. Close air support doctrine evolved rapidly during the December 23rd to 26th period. 4th Armored Division had attached air liaison officers to tank battalions, officers who could communicate directly with fighter bombers and direct strikes on targets immediately ahead of the ground advance. This coordination reached levels of effectiveness unprecedented in the European theater. Tank commanders identified German positions. Air controllers called in strikes. P-47S attacked within minutes. The ground advance resumed. This cycle repeated dozens of times daily, creating an integrated air-ground battle that German defenders couldn't counter. They either stayed hidden and let American tanks advance, or they revealed positions and got destroyed by aircraft. The combination of American air and ground power had achieved synergy that made German defensive positions nearly untenable. The psychological impact of clear weather extended beyond military effectiveness. For American soldiers who'd endured a week of fog and confusion, sunlight had almost spiritual significance. You could see the battlefield. You could see friendly forces. You could see where you were going. The fog had created a claustrophobic environment where the war existed only in the immediate vicinity. Clear weather expanded the perceptual horizon and made the war comprehensible again. Soldiers reported feeling less anxious, more confident, simply because they could see. This psychological effect on performance was difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. Units fought more effectively when they could see what they were fighting. December 26th afternoon, fog began returning. The 3-day window of clear weather was closing. Pilots flew as many missions as possible before visibility deteriorated. Ground commanders pushed attacks knowing that once the fog returned, progress would slow again. Everyone understood that the clear weather had been a temporary gift, an opportunity that had to be exploited completely before it disappeared. When the fog finally rolled back in that evening, both sides assessed what the clear weather had accomplished. For the Americans, it had enabled the resupply of Bastogne, the aerial destruction of German columns, and the coordination of ground attacks that brought 4th Armored to within striking distance of Bastogne. For the Germans, it had been catastrophic, exposing their formations to destruction and demonstrating that their offensive could succeed only under conditions where American air superiority was negated. The weather had been decisive not because it changed the battle's outcome, but because it accelerated that outcome, compressing weeks of potential fighting into 3 days of aerial slaughter. December 26, 1944, 0630 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams gathered his company commanders in the pre-dawn darkness for the briefing that would define their lives. His 37th Tank Battalion had been fighting toward Bastogne for 4 days, taking casualties, losing tanks, and gaining ground by yards rather than miles. Now they were 8 miles from Bastogne, and Abrams had received orders that eliminated any possibility of caution. Attack today. Reach Bastogne today. Or don't come back. The phrasing was Abrams's own, characteristic of his direct command style, But the sentiment came from higher up. Patton had promised relief by December 22nd. It was now December 26th. The delay was becoming politically embarrassing and militarily dangerous. Bastogne's ammunition was nearly exhausted. German forces were preparing another major assault. If relief didn't arrive today, it might arrive too late. Abrams told his officers that they would attack regardless of casualties, regardless of opposition, until they either reached Bastogne or the battalion ceased to exist as a fighting force. Nobody asked questions. Everyone understood. The attack jumped off at 1445 hours after artillery preparation that consumed ammunition 4th Armored could barely afford to expend. The route was through Assenois, a village 4 miles from Bastogne, held by German infantry and anti-tank guns. Intelligence suggested the position was lightly held, which intelligence had been suggesting about every position for the past 4 days, and which had been wrong about every position for the past 4 days. But there was no alternative route. Assenois lay directly on the road to Bastogne, and the road was the only route that armored vehicles could use at speed. So Abrams pointed his tanks at Assenois and attacked with the kind of concentrated violence that American armor doctrine preached but rarely achieved. It hit every available tank, every tank destroyer. Infantry mounted on tanks because half-tracks were too slow. Artillery firing ahead of the advance, lifting as the tanks approached, shifting to flanks to suppress German observers. This wasn't careful combined arms coordination. This was bludgeon tactics, using mass and momentum to overwhelm defenses before they could respond effectively. Lieutenant Charles Boggess commanded the lead tank company, which meant his Sherman would be first to make contact with the enemy, first to be targeted, first to know if the attack was succeeding or failing. Boggess was 22 years old and had been in combat for 6 months, which made him a veteran by December 1944 standards. His tank, nicknamed Cobra King, led a column of 6 Shermans advancing at maximum speed toward Assenois, and German anti-tank fire began immediately. A Panzerfaust rocket streaked past Boggess's turret, close enough that he felt the heat. Machine gun fire ricocheted off armor, but the American advance didn't slow. Doctrine said, you slow down when receiving fire, deploy infantry to clear threats, advance methodically. Abrams's orders said, ignore doctrine, maintain speed, accept casualties, reach Bastogne. Boggess kept his tank at 20 miles per hour, firing at anything that might be a German position, trusting that speed would make him harder to hit than precision would. 1450 hours, Cobra King broke through the German positions at Assenois. Boggess radioed back to Abrams. Advancing up the road, oh, don't fire on us. The message was critical because American artillery was scheduled to fire on the road to Bastogne to interdict German movements. If artillery didn't lift, Boggess would be driving into friendly fire. The artillery stopped. Boggess advanced. Behind him, 5 more Shermans followed, then infantry in half-tracks, then the rest of the battalion spreading out to secure the flanks. But Boggess didn't wait for the main force. He drove toward Bastogne as fast as his Sherman could move, watching for German positions, expecting at any moment to hit a roadblock or anti-tank gun that would stop the advance permanently. The road stayed clear. Either the Germans hadn't prepared defenses in depth, or they'd withdrawn in confusion. Boggess didn't know and didn't care. He just kept driving. 1455 hours. At first contact with American forces from Bastogne, Boggess saw foxholes, then helmets, then soldiers emerging from positions pointing rifles at his tank. He traversed his turret away from them, a gesture meaning, don't shoot, we're friendly. His radio operator transmitted on all frequencies. This is 4th Armored. We're coming into Bastogne. Don't fire. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The soldiers from Bastogne stared at the Sherman like it might be a hallucination. Boggess stared back, equally uncertain. Then someone started yelling, and suddenly everyone was yelling, soldiers climbing onto the tank, shaking hands with the crew, shouting questions and congratulations simultaneously. Boggess tried to maintain radio discipline, tried to report contact, tried to function professionally. But the emotion was overwhelming. They'd made it. 4 days of fighting, 8 miles that felt like 800, and they'd actually made it into Bastogne. 1,530 hours, General McAuliffe arrived at the perimeter to meet the relief force. He shook hands with Bogus, a gesture captured by photographers and turned into iconic imagery. McAuliffe said simply, "Glad to see you." Bogus, exhausted beyond the capacity for eloquence, replied, "We're glad to see you too." The exchange was notably understated considering the circumstances. No dramatic speeches, no theatrical celebration. Just two officers acknowledging successful completion of a military mission. The restraint was partly professional discipline, partly shell shock. Both men had been in continuous combat for over a week. Both had seen friends die. And they both understood that the relief was just the beginning of new problems, not the end of old ones. The corridor to Bastogne was barely 300 yards wide. German forces were on both sides and would certainly counterattack. The battle wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase. The initial relief convoy into Bastogne consisted of 70 vehicles carrying ammunition, medical supplies, gasoline, and food. The supplies were carefully prioritized. Ammunition first, because defensive capability mattered most. Medical supplies second, because wounded men were dying from lack of treatment. Food third, because soldiers could survive hungry longer than they could survive without ammunition or medical care. The convoy moved through the corridor under intermittent German artillery fire. All drivers maintaining speed because stopping in the corridor meant becoming a stationary target. Some vehicles were hit, others swerved around burning wrecks. The convoy kept moving because stopping meant failing, and failure meant the men in Bastogne stayed besieged. By sunset, the majority of supplies had reached Bastogne, transforming the garrison situation from desperate to merely critical. 1,900 hours, Patton entered Bastogne. He'd waited for the corridor to be secured enough that a three-star general's presence wouldn't create command chaos. His visit was brief and uncharacteristic. He toured the aid station, saw the wounded who'd been waiting days for evacuation, spoke with McAuliffe about defensive positions. Then he left without giving interviews to the press who'd accompanied him. Reporters found this strange. Patton normally loved publicity, but those who knew him understood. Patton had seen the cost of his promise. The wounded soldiers lying in the aid station, the destroyed buildings, the exhausted defenders. He'd promised relief and delivered it, but the price had been higher than he'd wanted to acknowledge publicly. His diary entry that night was brief. "We did it. God help the men who made it possible." By midnight, December 26th, the tactical situation around Bastogne had stabilized into a new configuration. The siege was broken, but not ended. American forces held a corridor roughly 300 yards wide, stretching 8 miles from Assenois to Bastogne. German forces held both sides of the corridor and were already preparing counterattacks to cut it. Inside Bastogne, and as the garrison had supplies for another few days, but remained surrounded except for the narrow corridor. 4th Armored had completed its primary mission, but had lost 37 tanks and over 800 men doing so. The relief was real, but fragile. Successful, but incomplete. Military historians would later debate whether this constituted true relief or simply transformation of the siege into a different form. What was certain was that the battle was far from over. The contrast between how the relief was reported and what it actually meant revealed the gap between public perception and military reality. Newspapers called it a dramatic rescue, a heroic dash, a triumph of American determination. The soldiers who'd fought it knew it was none of those things. It was a grinding advance against prepared positions, paid for with casualties that would haunt survivors. The corridor was so narrow that German artillery could fire across it. The supplies that reached Bastogne were enough to continue the battle, not enough to win it. And everyone involved knew that the next few days would determine whether the relief became permanent or whether the corridor would be cut and Bastogne re-surrounded. The heroism was real, the achievement was genuine, but the celebration was premature. War doesn't end with dramatic moments. It continues with exhausted soldiers doing difficult things until somebody gives up. And in December 1944, nobody was ready to give up yet. December 27th, 1944, dawn. The German counterattack came from Cibray, a village 2 miles west of the corridor, and it nearly succeeded in cutting the lifeline to Bastogne, before most Americans realized they were under attack. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, veterans of the Eastern Front who understood winter warfare better than most American units, struck at 0500 hours in darkness and fog. Their objective was simple and devastating: cut the corridor, re-isolate Bastogne, turn the relief into a temporary breakthrough that would collapse back into siege. The attack hit American positions that were thinly held because every available unit was either inside Bastogne or moving toward it. Companies that should have been dug in defensive positions were still arriving, still organizing, still trying to figure out where they were supposed to be. The Germans exploited this confusion ruthlessly. Panzers appeared out of the fog. Infantry followed. And suddenly American soldiers who thought they'd won were fighting for survival in hand-to-hand combat at 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The battle for Cibray lasted 8 hours and consumed forces that both sides could barely afford to lose. American infantry from the 26th Division fought house to house in a village they'd never seen before against SS troops who'd been ordered to take it regardless of casualties. The fighting was medieval in its brutality. Grenades thrown through windows, bayonets used because rifles jammed in the cold, men wrestling in frozen mud over possession of stone buildings that had no tactical value except that they controlled approaches to the corridor. By noon, the Americans held Cibray, but barely. 2 companies had been reduced to platoon strength. The battalion commander was dead. And German forces remained close enough to shell the corridor, which meant every vehicle running supplies to Bastogne was driving through artillery fire that could hit them from both sides simultaneously. December 28th brought the engineering challenge that determined whether the corridor would function as a supply route or remain a death trap. The road through the corridor was a single-lane country track designed for farm carts, not military traffic. Under the weight of tanks and trucks, it was disintegrating into mud. Engineers worked under fire to improve the road, bringing up gravel, laying steel matting, building bypasses around destroyed sections. 1 mile of road required 1,000 man-hours of labor just to make it passable for supply trucks. And the engineers worked in shifts because working continuously in 6-degree weather caused frostbite faster than the work could be completed. They worked under German artillery fire because the corridor was narrow enough that German observers could see the entire route. And they worked knowing that if the road failed, if it became impassable, then Bastogne would be isolated again, regardless of whether the corridor technically existed. December the 29th, 0300 hours, another German night attack, this time supported by armor, panzers advancing in darkness, guided by infantry who knew the terrain, hitting American positions that were exhausted from 2 days of continuous combat. The Germans used searchlights mounted on tanks, the same technique they'd employed on December 16th, creating artificial moonlight that illuminated American positions while leaving attackers in relative darkness. American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see, firing at muzzle flashes and engine sounds, calling for artillery support that took minutes to arrive because fire direction centers were overwhelmed with requests. The battle became a confused nightmare of close-range violence where friend and fire were distinguished by password challenges shouted over gunfire. Thunder! Flash! If you didn't know the password, you got shot. Some men died because they forgot the password under stress. Others survived because they remembered it while wounded and delirious. Bazooka teams became the heroes of the corridor defense, though their heroism was born from desperation rather than choice. American doctrine emphasized combined arms, using tanks and tank destroyers to fight enemy armor. But in the narrow corridor, in darkness, armor was as much liability as asset. Tanks couldn't maneuver, they couldn't see. They became targets for German Panzerfausts and assault guns. So infantry with bazookas became the primary anti-tank defense. Men would wait in foxholes until they could hear German tanks approaching, then fire at ranges so close that missing was almost impossible. The tactic worked but required a kind of courage that was nearly suicidal. You were sitting in a foxhole, freezing, listening to a 68-ton tank approaching, knowing that if your bazooka didn't penetrate the armor, or if the tank had infantry support you hadn't seen, you would die. The casualty rate among bazooka teams was over 50%, but they kept fighting because if they didn't, the tanks would break through. Medical evacuation from Bastogne began on December 30th and revealed the true cost of the siege. Ambulances running the gauntlet through the corridor under fire, drivers maintaining speed because slowing down meant becoming easier targets. The wounded they evacuated had been waiting a week for treatment that couldn't be provided in Bastogne's overwhelmed aid stations. Some had wounds that would have been survivable with immediate treatment, but had become life-threatening from infection or neglect. Others had frostbite amputations that could have been prevented with proper shelter and medical attention. The doctors and medics who had kept these men alive through the siege had performed miracles with minimal resources. But miracles couldn't substitute for evacuations, and the men being carried out of Bastogne bore evidence of what siege warfare did to human bodies when modern medicine became impossible. December the 31st brought the calculation that the corridor was finally secure, 3 miles wide instead of 300 yards, properly defended by 6 divisions, supply trucks running regularly without being shelled. The metric for success was simple. Could you drive from Ardennes to Bastogne without expecting to be killed? On December 31st, for the first time since the relief, the answer was yes. This didn't mean the corridor was safe. It meant it was survivable. German artillery still fired occasionally. Snipers still operated along the flanks. Patrols clashed in the woods on both sides. But the existential threat of the corridor being cut, of Bastogne being re-isolated, had diminished to the point where staff officers could plan operations beyond simple survival. The casualties from December 26th through 31st exceeded the casualties from the initial relief operation. 4th Armored Division lost another 300 men, widening the corridor. 26th Infantry Division lost over 1,000. 35th Infantry Division, brought in to secure the northern flank, lost 500. The total cost of not just reaching Bastogne, but making that relief permanent, was over 3,000 American casualties in 5 days. These numbers rarely appear in popular histories of the battle. The focus is on the dramatic breakthrough, the heroic relief, McAuliffe's defiance. But the soldiers who fought to hold the corridor open knew that their battle was harder than the battle to open it, because they fought without the adrenaline of a climactic moment, without the clarity of a single objective, just grinding defensive combat against an enemy who kept attacking, because cutting the corridor was Germany's last chance to salvage something from the offensive. The strategic irony was that while Americans focused on Bastogne, the broader Battle of the Bulge was being decided elsewhere. German forces had failed to reach the Meuse River. Allied counterattacks were compressing the Bulge from north and south. The German offensive had effectively ended by December 26th, though fighting would continue for weeks. Bastogne had served its strategic purpose by disrupting German logistics and forcing Germany to commit forces to a siege they couldn't win. But now, Bastogne was consuming Allied forces too. Divisions that could have been attacking elsewhere were instead defending a corridor to a town whose strategic value was declining daily. This created frustration among commanders who wanted to pivot from defense to offense but couldn't, because Bastogne remained vulnerable enough to require substantial defensive commitment. By January 1st, 1945, the corridor to Bastogne was secure enough that Third Army could begin planning offensive operations eastward. The siege had been broken. The relief had become permanent, and the men who'd fought in the corridor could finally rest. Though rest for combat soldiers meant being pulled back a few miles from the front line and given a few days without attack orders, they didn't get warm buildings or hot showers or leave to Paris. They got tents in snow and slightly better food and the knowledge that they had survived something that had killed many of their friends. Veterans would later say that holding the corridor open was harder than opening it, because there was no dramatic moment of success, just day after day of combat that eroded units through attrition until the enemy finally stopped attacking. This kind of warfare doesn't produce good stories. It produces statistics and trauma. And the statistics from the Bastogne corridor showed that American forces had paid a terrible price to keep a door open that the public assumed had been opened once and stayed open automatically. January 2nd, 1945, 4th Armored Division Headquarters. Staff officers compiled the assessment that would determine whether the division could continue combat operations or needed to be pulled back for reconstitution. The numbers were worse than anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. 4th Armored had begun the relief operation on December 22nd with 177 medium tanks, 50 light tanks, and approximately 10,000 men. 10 days later, the division reported 67 tanks destroyed outright, another 39 damaged beyond field repair capability, and 1,100 personnel casualties. The mathematics were brutal. The division had lost over 40% of its armor and 10% of its personnel in 10 days. At these rates, 4th Armored Division would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within another month of similar operations. The assessment concluded that the division needed 2 weeks minimum for refitting, integration of replacement equipment and personnel, and rest for surviving veterans who were approaching psychological and physical collapse. January 5th, field hospitals across the 3rd Army sector revealed a crisis that tactical reports had missed. Surgeons had performed over 500 amputations due to frostbite in the past 2 weeks. 500. These weren't combat wounds. These were injuries caused by exposure to cold in conditions where proper shelter was impossible and medical treatment was delayed. Soldiers had fought in temperatures between 0 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit for days or weeks, without adequate winter gear, without dry socks, without heated shelters. Feet went numb. Soldiers ignored the numbness because stopping to address it meant falling behind their units. By the time medics examined them, tissue was dead. Amputation was the only option. These men would survive, but never fight again. Never walk normally again. Live the rest of their lives disabled because they had been ordered to advance regardless of weather, and had obeyed. The frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units, a statistic that raised questions about whether the relief operation had been managed correctly or whether speed had been prioritized over soldier welfare beyond acceptable limits. The replacement depot at Ardennes processed 3,000 new soldiers in the first week of January, feeding them into 3rd Army units that had been depleted during the Bastogne operation. These replacements averaged 12 weeks of training. Some had never fired their weapons in combat. None had experienced winter warfare. They arrived at units where the veterans were exhausted, traumatized, and often resentful of replacements who hadn't shared the battle they had just survived. Integration was supposed to be careful, pairing new soldiers with veterans who could mentor them. In practice, replacements were pushed into foxholes and expected to figure things out, because there wasn't time for careful integration when units were still in contact with the enemy. The survival rate for replacements was lower than for veterans because they made mistakes that experienced soldiers had learned not to make. But the replacement system didn't have time to train them better because the Army needed bodies in foxholes, and warm bodies were better than empty foxholes. Graves registration units worked through January recovering bodies that had been left on battlefields during the advance to Bastogne. Some had been frozen in the positions where they fell, preserved by cold that prevented normal decomposition. Others were buried in shallow graves by comrades who didn't have time for proper burials. The recovery teams worked systematically, marking bodies, collecting identification, arranging transport to cemeteries. It was grim work made worse by cold and the knowledge that some bodies wouldn't be found until spring thaw. Families would receive telegrams saying their sons or husbands or fathers were missing in action, not knowing whether that meant captured or dead. Waiting months for final confirmation that often came only when remains were identified during spring recovery operations. The bureaucratic machinery of death notification was overwhelmed by casualties from the Battle of the Bulge, creating backlogs that meant some families learned of losses weeks after they occurred. January 12, Patton's diary contained an entry that revealed his private reckoning with the cost of his promise. "We did what we said we would do, but the price was terrible. I wonder if Bastogne was worth what we paid for it." This was extraordinary for Patton, who rarely admitted doubt publicly or privately. He'd built his reputation on aggressive action, on promising victories and delivering them regardless of cost. Second-guessing himself wasn't part of his character or his command philosophy. But the casualties from the Bastogne operation had forced even Patton to confront the question that soldiers and historians would debate for decades. Was Bastogne worth 15,000 casualties? Could the siege have been broken with fewer losses through different tactics? Should 3rd Army have waited, prepared more carefully, accepted a longer timeline if it meant fewer men killed? Patton's diary didn't answer these questions. It simply acknowledged that they existed, that even he couldn't dismiss them entirely. Yet vehicle losses told another dimension of the story. Third Army had lost 156 medium tanks, 89 light tanks, and over 300 trucks and half-tracks during the Bastogne operation. These weren't just numbers. They represented months of production. Sherman tanks required 8 months from raw materials to combat delivery. Replacing 156 Shermans meant production capacity that could have supplied an entire new armored division. The trucks were equally critical. American logistics depended on trucks. Losing 300 meant reducing supply capacity across the entire Army. The material cost of the Bastogne operation would affect Third Army's capabilities for months, limiting offensive operations, reducing the Army's ability to maintain momentum, and creating cascading effects that wouldn't be visible in headlines but would be felt by every soldier who had to fight with inadequate support, because the vehicles that should have delivered that support had been destroyed in December. Psychological casualties spiked in January as the immediate crisis passed and men had time to process what they'd experienced. Combat exhaustion, the contemporary term for what would later be called post-traumatic stress, affected roughly 20% of men in some units. Symptoms range from inability to sleep to complete psychological breakdown. The Army's response was pragmatic and often cruel. Men who could still function were kept in the line. Men who couldn't were evacuated to hospitals and often never returned to combat. There was no sophisticated understanding of trauma, no therapy beyond rest and time. Soldiers were expected to endure stress until they broke, then discarded when they did. The medical system treated psychological casualties with the same triage logic as physical casualties. Can this man return to combat? If yes, minimal treatment and quick return. If no, evacuation and replacement. The human cost of this system was immense, but invisible because psychological wounds didn't appear in casualty statistics the way missing limbs did. The quality degradation of veteran divisions was perhaps the most serious long-term consequence of the Bastogne operation. 4th Armored had been one of the finest armored divisions in the European theater, with experienced crews, proven tactics, and cohesion built through months of combat. By January 1945, 4th Armored was still an effective division, but no longer elite. Veteran crews had been killed or evacuated. Replacements lacked the skill that made the division exceptional. Unit cohesion had degraded because so many original members were gone. The division could still execute missions, but it couldn't perform at the level it had achieved before Bastogne. This degradation affected every unit that fought in the battle. The army that emerged from the Bulge was larger, reinforced with fresh divisions brought from the United States. But the veteran divisions that had carried the fighting were worn down in ways that numbers couldn't capture. Financial cost rarely entered military history, but the Bastogne operation consumed resources on a scale that deserves acknowledgement. The ammunition expenditure exceeded normal monthly consumption by 300%. Fuel consumption spiked similarly. The replacement equipment and vehicles cost hundreds of millions of dollars in 1944 currency. Medical treatment for casualties would continue costing money for decades as wounded veterans required care. When accountants calculated the total cost of relieving Bastogne, the figure ran into billions. This wasn't waste. It was the price of modern war, where industrial nations could afford to expend material wealth on scales that would have bankrupted previous generations. But the expenditure had limits. Every dollar spent in the Ardennes was a dollar not available for other operations. The Battle of the Bulge delayed other offensives, consumed resources allocated for different purposes, and demonstrated that even America's vast industrial capacity had constraints. January 15, casualty reports finalized, showed that Third Army had suffered approximately 15,000 casualties during the Bastogne relief operation from December 22nd through December 31st. Killed, wounded, missing, or captured. 15,000 men in 10 days. For context, that exceeded total American casualties on D-Day. It approached casualties from the entire Guadalcanal campaign, and it represented roughly 6% of Third Army's total strength, enough to seriously degrade combat effectiveness across the entire formation. These casualties were concentrated in frontline infantry and armor units, which meant the actual loss rate in fighting formations was much higher than the army-wide average. But some battalions lost 50% of their strength. Some companies were commanded by lieutenants because all the captains and majors were casualties. The relief of Bastogne succeeded militarily, but at a cost that raised serious questions about whether the operation had been managed as efficiently as it could have been, or whether the pressure to fulfill Patton's promise had driven decisions that maximized casualties. January 3, 1945, Hitler's headquarters, East Prussia. The Führer finally authorized what his generals had been requesting for a week: withdrawal from the western tip of the salient, the positions deepest into Allied territory, the ground that had been taken at such terrible cost, and couldn't be held without supply lines that no longer functioned. The order came too late. Some German units at the western extent of the penetration had been cut off for 3 days, surviving on ammunition they had carried and whatever they could capture. They'd been fighting without resupply, without reinforcement, without hope of relief, because Hitler refused to acknowledge that the offensive had failed until failure became undeniable even to him. The delay between when withdrawal should have been ordered and when it was actually ordered cost Germany thousands of soldiers who could have escaped, but instead were captured or killed. This was characteristic of Hitler's command style in late war: refusal to accept reality until reality forced itself upon him through catastrophe. January 8th, the German retreat became a slaughter visible from the air, as Allied fighter bombers found German columns stretched along roads in conditions even worse than the December 23rd attacks. German forces were withdrawing, which meant they couldn't disperse or hide effectively. They had to use roads because moving cross-country in winter was impossible for vehicles, and the roads became killing zones. American pilots described it as worse than the Falaise Gap, the notorious battle in France where retreating German forces had been massacred from the air. One P-47 pilot reported making 6 attack runs on a single column, expending all ammunition and fuel, landing to rearm and refuel, and returning to find the column still there, still burning, still trying to withdraw. The Germans couldn't surrender to aircraft. They could only endure the attacks and hope to reach cover before being destroyed. The 5th Panzer Army headquarters on January 10th revealed the scale of German losses through documents captured when Allied forces overran command posts. General Manteuffel had calculated that his army had lost 70% of its armored strength. Divisions that had attacked with over 100 tanks reported fewer than 30 operational. The losses weren't just from combat. Many tanks had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel during the retreat. Crews disabled the vehicles as best they could, usually by destroying the engines, then withdrew on foot. The fields of the Ardennes were littered with German tanks that had simply stopped moving when fuel ran out and been left because there was no way to recover them. This abandonment of equipment represented the complete collapse of German logistics. An army that couldn't fuel its tanks was an army that had lost the industrial war. January 15th, German units crossing back into Germany carried a fraction of the strength they had had when the offensive began. Exact casualty figures for the German side remain disputed because record-keeping collapsed during the retreat. Estimates range from 67,000 to 125,000 casualties, depending on whether you count missing soldiers as casualties or not. Many men listed as missing had simply walked away, deserting to go home or hide, understanding that Germany had lost the war and seeing no point in continuing to fight. This desertion rate was unprecedented for the Wehrmacht, which had maintained discipline even during catastrophic defeats on the Eastern Front. Both the willingness of German soldiers to desert in numbers reflected their understanding that the Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last chance, and it had failed completely. Equipment losses were staggering enough that Germany couldn't recover. Somewhere between 600 and 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or captured, over 1,000 artillery pieces, 6,000 trucks and support vehicles. These numbers represented not just current combat power, but future capability. Germany's industrial capacity by January 1945 was severely degraded by Allied bombing. Replacing the equipment lost in the Ardennes would take months, and Germany didn't have months. The losses were permanent, and they left German forces across the Western Front incapable of mobile defense. Without tanks, without trucks, Without artillery, German formations could defend fixed positions, but couldn't maneuver, couldn't counterattack, couldn't respond to Allied offensives with anything except static resistance. The strategic consequences extended beyond the Western Front. Germany had weakened its Eastern Front to provide forces for the Ardennes offensive. Veteran divisions, artillery, armor, all had been pulled from positions facing the Soviets and sent west for the attack. Now, those forces were destroyed or shattered, and the Eastern Front had been weakened for nothing. Soviet intelligence had tracked the German transfers and planned accordingly. When the Soviet winter offensive began on January 12th, it struck German positions that lacked the reserves to contain the breakthrough. Soviet forces advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, and at a pace that might have been impossible if Germany had kept its reserves in the east instead of spending them in the Ardennes. Hitler's decision to attack in the west had directly enabled Soviet advances in the east. Personal accounts from German soldiers during the retreat revealed the psychological collapse that accompanied military defeat. Prisoners spoke of knowing the war was lost, of fighting only because not fighting meant execution by SS security units. They described the Ardennes offensive as the moment when they understood Germany couldn't win, that all the propaganda about wonder weapons and final victory was lies, that they were fighting for a regime that was sending them to die for no strategic purpose. This disillusionment was visible in surrender rates, and German soldiers surrendered in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1943 or even 1944. Some units didn't fight at all, just waited for American forces to reach them and surrendered immediately. The will to continue fighting had broken not because German soldiers were cowardly, but because they understood the war was lost and saw no honor in dying for a lost cause. January 20th, Hitler's headquarters, brought the scapegoating that always followed German military failures. Hitler relieved several generals, blaming them for the offensive's failure, while refusing to acknowledge that his strategic conception had been flawed from the beginning. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the nominal commander in the West, was effectively sidelined. Manteuffel, who had commanded 5th Panzer Army competently under impossible conditions, received criticism for not taking Bastogne. Officers who had expressed doubts about the offensive before it began found those doubts resurrected as evidence of defeatism. The command purge served Hitler's psychological need to blame others for failures rather than accept responsibility himself. It also damaged German command effectiveness by removing experienced officers and replacing them with loyalists who lacked comparable skill. The Bastogne focus in German after-action analysis revealed how much psychological weight that single town had carried. German commanders discussed Bastogne as the turning point, the place where the offensive had failed decisively. If Bastogne had fallen on December 21st, they argued, the offensive might have succeeded. This was probably self-serving rationalization. The offensive was failing along the entire front for reasons beyond Bastogne. But Bastogne was easier to blame than admitting that the entire strategic concept was flawed, that Germany lacked the logistics to sustain a deep offensive, that American forces were more resilient than German planning had assumed. Blaming Bastogne allowed German commanders to preserve the belief that they'd done everything possible and failed only because of one tactical setback, rather than accepting that the offensive had been doomed from inception. By February 1st, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. German forces had withdrawn to approximately their December 16th start lines. Allied forces controlled the same territory they'd held before the offensive, all plus some gains on the flanks. The battlefield result was a return to the status quo ante, as if the battle had never happened. But the strategic situation had changed fundamentally. Germany had spent its last mobile reserves and achieved nothing. The Western Allies had absorbed a massive surprise attack, contained it, and counterattacked successfully, demonstrating that German offensives could no longer achieve strategic objectives, even with tactical surprise. And the Soviets were advancing in the east without effective German resistance. The war would continue for 3 more months, but its outcome had been determined in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where Hitler's final gamble had failed and Germany's last hope had died with thousands of soldiers who deserved better than to be sacrificed for a lost cause. January 16th, and 1945, Yalta, Crimea. Allied leaders gathered for the conference that would shape the post-war world, and the Battle of the Bulge influenced negotiations in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Roosevelt arrived weakened by the shock of the German offensive, facing questions from Congress and the American public about why intelligence had failed so completely. Churchill arrived concerned that American forces might not be capable of finishing the war without British leadership, a concern that Montgomery's claims about commanding the northern shoulder of the Bulge had reinforced. Stalin arrived strengthened by knowledge that the German offensive in the west had weakened German defenses in the east, making his planned offensives more likely to succeed. The power dynamics between the three leaders had shifted because of events in the Ardennes. Stalin could ask for more concessions because he was delivering more results. Roosevelt had less leverage because American military performance had been questioned, and Churchill found himself mediating between two powers that didn't need British mediation as much as they had a year earlier. The strategic reassessment across Allied headquarters reached a surprising conclusion. The Battle of the Bulge had lengthened the war. Before the German offensive, Allied planners estimated Germany would surrender by April 1945. After the offensive, estimates pushed that date to June or July. The delay wasn't because Germany had gained territory. The delay was because the offensive had consumed Allied resources, disrupted Allied planning, or enforced reallocation of forces to defensive positions rather than offensive operations. Third Army alone had to commit 6 divisions to the Bastogne sector that could have been attacking elsewhere. British forces in the north had paused offensive operations to contain the German penetration. The entire Allied strategy had been thrown off schedule by 6 weeks, and those 6 weeks would cost thousands of additional casualties as the war continued into spring. Command structure disputes nearly fractured Allied unity after the Bulge. Montgomery had claimed credit for stabilizing the northern shoulder of the German penetration, a claim that wasn't entirely false, but was delivered with characteristic arrogance that infuriated American commanders. Ellen Bradley felt Montgomery was trying to take credit for American soldiers fighting, while implicitly criticizing American command. Eisenhower found himself mediating between commanders whose egos were threatening operational cooperation. The solution was political rather than military. Montgomery's role was quietly reduced. Bradley retained command of American forces, and Eisenhower made clear that future command arrangements would follow national lines rather than competence, because managing Allied politics mattered as much as managing military operations. The compromise satisfied nobody, but prevented a complete breakdown in cooperation. Washington, January 20th, brought the Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting that analyzed lessons from the Bulge. The conclusions were damning about American intelligence, training, and winter equipment. The intelligence had failed to predict the offensive despite ample evidence. Training had proven inadequate for winter warfare, leaving soldiers unprepared for the conditions they encountered. Winter equipment was insufficient, leading to catastrophic frostbite casualties. The Joint Chiefs ordered reforms across all 3 areas. Intelligence procedures were revised to emphasize warning indicators even when they contradicted prevailing assumptions. Training was extended to include winter warfare for all units deploying to Europe, and winter equipment procurement was accelerated, though the new equipment wouldn't reach frontline units until the war was nearly over. The reforms came too late for the men who'd fought in the Bulge, but they would prevent similar failures in future conflicts. Production decisions made in late January revealed how seriously the Battle of the Bulge had impacted American materiel. Tank production was increased to replace losses faster than planned. Ammunition production, especially artillery ammunition, which had been consumed at unprecedented rates, was ramped up. Truck production received priority because logistics vehicles had proven as critical as combat vehicles. These production increases came at the expense of other priorities. Landing craft production for the Pacific was delayed. Strategic bomber production was reduced. The industrial machinery of American war-making was flexible enough to respond to new priorities. But the flexibility had limits. You couldn't produce everything simultaneously at maximum rates. Choices had to be made. And the Bulge determined those choices for the first several months of 1945. Germany, February 8th, experienced civilian morale collapse when the scale of Ardennes losses became known through soldiers returning from the front. The Nazi propaganda machine had built up the offensive as Germany's great counterattack, the operation that would change the war. When it failed, when soldiers came home describing catastrophic defeat, civilian faith in Nazi leadership cratered. People who'd believed in eventual German victory began preparing for occupation. Black market activity increased as civilians stockpiled goods expecting societal collapse. Desertion rates from the Wehrmacht spiked as soldiers realized fighting for a lost cause was pointless. The Gestapo responded with increased terror, or executing deserters publicly as examples. But terror couldn't restore faith in victory when everyone could see that victory was impossible. March 7th, Remagen brought the consequence that most directly resulted from the Ardennes offensive. American forces captured an intact bridge across the Rhine River, establishing a bridgehead on the German side that should have been impossible to create. The bridge should have been defended by German reserves, by mobile divisions capable of counterattacking the bridgehead before it could be expanded. But those reserves had died in the Ardennes. The divisions that should have been defending the Rhine were destroyed or shattered. Germany lacked the forces to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead, which meant American forces could expand it, exploit it, and use it to cross into Germany proper. Remagen was possible because Bastogne had consumed the forces that should have prevented it. The causal chain was direct. Hitler's decision to attack in the Ardennes had directly enabled Allied success at Remagen. The final strategic irony appeared in Soviet planning documents captured after the Cold War ended. Soviet generals had calculated that the Battle of the Bulge served Soviet interests perfectly by keeping German forces committed in the West, while Soviet offensives developed in the East. Stalin had no interest in the Ardennes fighting ending quickly because prolonged combat in the West meant fewer German forces opposing Soviet advances. When the battle dragged into January, Soviet planners were pleased because it meant their offensives would face even less resistance. The Western Allies and Germany fought each other to exhaustion in the Ardennes, and the Soviets benefited strategically from both sides' losses. This outcome shaped the post-war balance of power in Europe, giving the Soviet Union stronger negotiating position at Yalta and enabling Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe that might have been contested if Western Allied forces had advanced farther east. April and May brought the final offensives that ended the war in Europe, and those offensives were shaped by the Bulge's aftermath. Allied forces advanced into Germany against resistance that was fierce in places but strategically hopeless. German forces lacked the mobile reserves to conduct effective defense. They could hold positions temporarily, but couldn't counterattack, couldn't maneuver, couldn't do anything except delay inevitable defeat. The Wehrmacht that had fought across Europe for 5 years was reduced to static defense by soldiers who knew they had lost, but fought anyway out of discipline, fear of SS execution squads, or simple refusal to surrender. The war ended May 8th with German unconditional surrender, 3 months after the Ardennes fighting ended, connected to that battle through the consumption of Germany's last strategic reserves in an offensive that achieved nothing except hastening the end it was supposed to prevent. 1970, suburban New Jersey. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, retired, sat for an interview about his experience as the first American to enter Bastogne. The interviewer expected heroic narrative, dramatic storytelling, the kind of tale that had been told in movies and books for 25 years. Boggess's response was unexpected. That we didn't feel heroic. We felt cold and scared. The myth came later. He described the relief not as a triumphant dash, but as a grinding advance where friends died, and luck mattered as much as skill. He talked about the men who didn't make it, whose tanks burned before reaching Bastogne, whose names appeared in casualty reports rather than history books. And he expressed discomfort with how the story had been simplified, how complexity had been reduced to myth, how the real experience of cold and fear and grief had been transformed into national narrative about American heroism. The interview was never published. It didn't match what audiences wanted to hear. 1983, Third Army veteran reunion in Kansas City, brought together aging men who'd fought in the Bastogne operation. They gathered in a hotel ballroom, wearing suits and ties, comparing memories across tables covered with coffee cups and old photographs. The conversations revealed how differently men remembered the same events. Some recalled the march north as the hardest thing they'd ever done. Others remembered the combat as worse. A few insisted the cold was the real enemy. They argued about details, disagreed about timelines, but reached consensus on one point. The march to Bastogne was harder than the fighting. The movement through ice storms and darkness, the exhaustion and uncertainty, had been more traumatic than combat, because it had lasted longer and offered no adrenaline, no moment of climax, just endless grinding misery. This perspective rarely appeared in histories, which focused on battles rather than movements, on combat rather than preparation. Military historians debated Patton's relief operation in academic journals through the 1980s and 90s, and no consensus emerged. One school argued the relief was militarily necessary because Bastogne's garrison was genuinely at risk of being overrun, if not relieved quickly. Another school contended that Bastogne was holding successfully and could have continued holding, making Patton's promise more about publicity than military necessity. A third school suggested the truth was somewhere between, that Bastogne might have held, but the risk of its falling was high enough to justify the relief effort despite its costs. The debate was impossible to resolve because it required knowing what would have happened if Patton hadn't attacked, and counterfactual history can't be proven. But the debate itself revealed something important. Patton's relief wasn't obviously correct. It was a decision that could be questioned, that intelligent people could disagree about, that involved trade-offs between lives and time and objectives that had no perfect answer. 1998 brought discovery of previously classified ultra-intercepts that complicated the historical narrative. British codebreakers had known by December 23rd that the German offensive was failing, that logistics had collapsed, that the advance had stalled across the entire front. This intelligence was shared with Eisenhower, but not with Bradley or Patton, withheld for political reasons related to maintaining security around Ultra's existence. The revelation raised difficult questions. If Eisenhower knew the German offensive was failing on December 23rd, was Patton's relief operation still necessary? Could Bastogne have held another few days until German forces withdrew due to supply failure? The classified intelligence suggested that maybe, possibly, the relief was less critical than it appeared at the time. But maybe is not certainly, and commanders had to make decisions based on information available to them, not information they didn't have. Computer simulations run by military analysts in the early 2000s suggested alternative routes to Bastogne that might have reduced casualties. Modern mapping technology and tactical modeling indicated that 4th Armored Division could have approached from a different direction, or through terrain that was slightly easier to defend for the attackers and harder to defend for the Germans. The simulation suggested relief might have been achieved 36 hours earlier, with fewer casualties if this route had been taken. But the simulation also noted that this route wasn't known to exist in December 1944. Maps available to American commanders didn't show it as passable for armor. Local knowledge that would have identified the route wasn't accessible. The simulation proved that better routes existed but couldn't prove they were knowable at the time, which meant criticizing Patton's route selection was historically unfair, even if tactically justified. The mythology versus reality of Patton's dash became a case study in how military history gets simplified for public consumption. Popular culture depicted the relief as a rapid armored thrust, a race against time, a dramatic rescue. The reality was methodical village-to-village fighting across 12 miles in 4 days, losing tanks and men at each village, facing determined German resistance, achieving success through superior logistics rather than superior tactics. The dash was invented by newspaper reporters who needed dramatic narratives for readers back home. It persisted because it was better storytelling than grinding advance. And it shaped public memory so completely that most Americans even today think of Bastogne's relief as a rapid breakthrough rather than costly fighting advance. The gap between mythology and reality revealed how warfare gets remembered versus how it gets fought. Comparative military analysis placed Third Army's movement in context by examining other rapid redeployments in World War II. Soviet Operation Bagration in June 1944 moved armies farther, faster, with less notice than Patton's movement north. Soviet forces redeployed entire fronts, millions of men, across hundreds of miles in weeks. The comparison wasn't meant to diminish Third Army's achievement, but to recognize that rapid redeployment was something multiple armies accomplished during World War II, not a unique American capability. What made Third Army's movement notable was the logistics coordination, the staff work, the ability to maintain supply while pivoting 90 degrees. These weren't glamorous achievements, but they were impressive demonstrations of military professionalism. The comparison to Soviet operations also highlighted how Western memory of World War II focused on Western achievements while often ignoring larger operations on the Eastern Front. Technical assessment by modern military planners concluded that Third Army's movement north represented world-class logistics but average tactical execution. The movement was planned and executed brilliantly. The subsequent fighting was competent but not exceptional. Germans generally outfought Americans at tactical level, achieving better kill ratios in most engagements. American success came from logistics superiority, firepower advantage, and air supremacy, not from superior small unit tactics. Though this assessment challenged American narratives about infantry excellence and suggested that American military strength in World War II was primarily industrial and organizational rather than tactical. The conclusion was uncomfortable for military tradition, but supported by casualty analysis and engagement studies that showed German forces consistently performing better tactically even while losing strategically. Veterans' perspectives gathered through decades of oral history, projects emphasized themes that official histories minimized. Cold and exhaustion dominated memories more than combat. Most veterans remembered being constantly cold, constantly tired, constantly hungry. They remembered friends who died and felt guilt about surviving. They remembered confusion and uncertainty more than clarity about objectives. And they remembered that the heroism attributed to them felt unearned because they'd simply done what orders required, and calling that heroism seemed to cheapen the word. These perspectives revealed the gap between soldier experience and civilian understanding, between how war felt to participants and how it appeared to observers. The veterans weren't trying to diminish their achievement. They were trying to communicate that achievement in war was more complex and less noble than mythology suggested. The historical legacy of Bastogne's relief operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, it was a successful relief operation that achieved its military objective. At the strategic level, it disrupted German offensive plans and contributed to Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. At the political level, it demonstrated American military competence at a time when that competence was being questioned. At the mythological level, it became a story about American determination and heroic rescue that served post-war national identity. All these levels were true simultaneously. The relief was both tactically successful and strategically questionable, both militarily impressive and propagandistically useful, both genuine achievement and constructed mythology. Understanding Bastogne required holding all these truths simultaneously, rather than choosing one narrative over others. December 26, 2024, Bastogne, Belgium. The 80th anniversary ceremony brought together the last surviving veterans, elderly men in wheelchairs surrounded by families and officials. Belgian civilians still grateful after 8 decades. 8 American military delegations honoring their predecessors. European dignitaries acknowledging American sacrifice. Everyone celebrating the relief with speeches and ceremonies and wreath layings. The veterans participated but with visible ambivalence. When journalists asked about heroism, they deflected. When asked about the significance of Bastogne, they talked about friends who died. In private conversations away from ceremonies, they acknowledged that the myth and reality coexisted as separate things, both true in different ways. Yes, they'd achieved something significant. Yes, the relief mattered, but also, yes, it cost more than they'd wanted to pay, hurt more than they could explain, and felt less heroic from inside the experience than it looked from outside. Yet the final assessment of Patton's relief of Bastogne remained what it had always been: contested. Military historians couldn't agree whether it was necessary or publicity-driven, whether the tactics were sound or wasteful, whether the costs were justified or excessive. What wasn't contested was that it happened, that men fought through terrible conditions to reach other men who needed help, that the battle was won through determination and suffering that no historical analysis could fully capture. The 90 miles from the Sarre to Bastogne represented more than geographic distance. They represented the distance between promise and fulfillment, between confidence and doubt, between the simple narratives that nations tell themselves and the complex realities that veterans carried silently for the rest of their lives. History remembers the achievement. The men who achieved it remembered the cost. Both memories were true. Both deserve acknowledgement. And the tension between them is what makes Patton's dash to Bastogne endlessly fascinating and endlessly troubling to study 80 years later.